Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Became Shigaraki's Obsession? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. If you want to be a hero that badly, there's a quick way to do it. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a last chance dive off the roof. Bakugo Katsuki mockingly sneered, leaving the pathetic shivering mess that was his quirkless classmate in the classroom by himself. Midoriya Izuku's beloved notebook long thrown out the window, soaked in a fountain down below. There was nothing he could bring himself to say. Only quivering until he was left behind where he regained his bearings. Dive off the roof? Idiot. If I really jumped, that would mean you instigated a suicide. Think before you speak. Midoriya had made his way down to outside their junior high school, searching for his notebook, filled with nothing but elaborate and impressive notes and analyses of the greatest heroes. It was all he could do. What he lacked in power and natural talent that Bakugo had been blessed with, he could at least make up in devotion and studying. He only stared at his hard work soaking in the fish pond, becoming more ruined from the water and burns the blonde student had caused. His work, his passion, was confined to a simple book. His purpose in a notebook. His self-worth in a notebook. And here it was, drowning, torn, burned, treated so worthlessly by his classmates. That's not fish food, stupid. He snatched it back from 3 koi beginning to nibble on it. That's my notebook, stupid. Stupid. Thief. Someone. Catch me if you can. Downtown in the same very city, a disgusting, slimy villain fled down the city with stolen cash leaving a trail behind. An eager grin spread wide across his green face, feeling like no hero would bother to go after him after the villain's suppression with Mount Lady and the cleanup afterward. There's no hero around? Normally someone would come right away. This guy's taking advantage of the chaos from this morning. There are a ton of people around who don't know what to do with their quirks. There's no end to them. Passerbys only watched as the villain made his getaway. They did nothing, just watch. No heroes in the making. No courage to be seen. Not even someone checking on the victims of the robbery. They just simply waited for a hero to come. The heroes fix everything. And thus, only the greatest of them all appeared behind the small cluster of citizens on the sidewalk. Buff, tall, strong, smiling brightly, entering the conversation with hearty words. There is an end. Why? He stepped forward, stepping up to the challenge. His powerful voice carried to the non-existent ears of the villain of slime, causing a small twinge of panic. Because I am here. All Might said calmly with all his glowing pride as the symbol of peace. The small freckled boy, deep in his thoughts of his past, was dragging his feet home. Quirkless? It doesn't matter. UA takes kids without quirks now. He has a chance. The nice man with the weird head even believed in him. He wasn't strong, but he was smart. He had the passion, right? He could still be a hero. He could be just like his idol. He could be just like All Might. Midoriya decided back then, didn't he? Back then, in the arms of his crying mother. It doesn't matter what Bakugo and his followers said. That's right. Don't worry about what other people think. Midoriya clenched his fist to his chest and looked up at the sunny blue sky, watching the cherry blossoms drift by so peacefully. There was hope for him, surely. Hold your head up high and plunge forward. His dragging pace had turned into a childish stomping march as he held his fist up above his head, mimicking All Might's trademark hearty laugh. He began passing under a bridge tunnel, going towards the light of the other side. And yet, in his naive burst of hope, he could not ignore the looming sound behind him, growing louder. He stopped his laughter and turned around to see a massive accumulation of slime appearing before him, twice, no, 3 or 4 times his size. All that bravado was gone in a single instant when faced with such a frightening sight. A villain? He cried out loud. A medium-sized invisibility cloak? A deep, scraggly voice muttered, rising from the ground. He quickly made eye contact with this shivering child standing in his path. Before more than a scream could leave Midoriya's lips, he tried to turn and run away only to be engulfed from behind, brought to the ground in an instant. His notebook was dropped and sent to the side. Any attempt at a cry for help was muffled by the awful slime being forced down his throat, unable to fight it as his body was restrained by even more slime. Face to face with this villain, he was only reminded by how powerless he was. "Don't worry. I'm just going to take over your body. Calm down. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. You'll feel better soon." The villain almost tried to soothe the freckled child as he got closer and closer to suffocating him. Midoriya began to tear up, crying again as he had done so often. It was all he could do. He desperately tried to grab at the villain to pry him away, but to no avail. "You can't grab me. I'm fluid." The slime mocked and even held the boy a bit closer, shutting his own eyes. "Thanks for your help. You're my hero." He then opened them again to gaze at the crying child he had lifted off his feet, choke and struggle in his grasp. He could feel his struggling growing weaker. His movements were slowing down. Dying? Was he dying? Midoriya's gaze, blurred with tears and the lack of oxygen, could only be traced to his open notebook. The page he had started with his dream costume was open. What he wanted to be, his future, it was right there in front of him. Was he going to die before he could even try to achieve what he's always wanted? Somebody. He just wanted somebody to save him before he could have his future. His consciousness was fading. Was he going to be abandoned by his own fate? It was then he blacked out. Alas, he was not dead. Midoriya's eyes twitched, feeling nothing around him suddenly. He could breathe fully. He could move. His big green eyes only opened halfway, finding himself in midair and seeing a silhouette of the one that inspired him the most. It was a dream, wasn't it? The #1 hero in front of him, grocery bag in hand, and yet posed in a punching motion with remains of slime floating around him. Oh my, he couldn't bring himself to even say the full name, missing just the last sound before he fell unconscious just one more time. But this time Midoriya felt a succession of light slapping against his freckled cheek. "Hey!" He dashed. He heard a deep voice calling out to him when he blinked a few times, adjusting to the bright light. He made it outside the tunnel. By himself? No, that's not right. "Oh, good," the deep voice said again, the owner holding his fingers up to his brow in relief, standing over him. All Might himself, in the flesh, right in front of him. His first reaction was to only scream and scoot back a few feet out of sheer panic. "I'm glad you're okay," his hero said, standing up tall with a hand on his hip. "Sorry about getting you caught up in my villain fighting. I don't usually make mistakes like this, but I was in high spirits on my day off in a new place. But you were a big help. Thanks." He let out another one of his trademark laughs with his signature smile on his face. He was nothing short of simply being bright. A bright shining light of hope, his hero, his idol right in front of him. All Might then held up a bottle filled to the brim with green slime. Captured him safely. His smile shined so brightly to the boy that was infatuated with all his work. "Oh right, an A autograph. Where should I?" Midoriya began to frantically feel at his school uniform, desperately searching for the notebook he remembered holding before being attacked. He quickly found it on the ground and reached for it. In that notebook, he flipped to a pair that used to be blank pages, now filled with a giant signature. "He already did," he nearly screeched, standing up and then rapidly bowing over and over, kind of scaring the #1 hero. Thank you very much. It'll be an heirloom. A family treasure," the child said with all the gratefulness in his heart. Midoriya received a thumbs up with a small sparkle and a solid okay by the hero. "Well, I need to take this guy to the police. See you again on the other side of the screen." All Might strapped the trapped villain to his leg as tightly as he could before giving the young Midoriya a small wave and preparing to leap off. But there was something Midoriya needed to know. Something he had to ask. "Wait already?" Midoriya questioned softly, disappointed almost. "Pros are constantly fighting enemies and time," his hero answered, stretching and flexing, needing to prepare for a massive takeoff. But he couldn't leave yet. There were so many questions. There was something. "Well then, I'm counting on your continued support." The pro-hero leapt off with expected grace and extreme power. But he quickly noticed something was very wrong. Very, very wrong. Wait. He looked back at his leg to see the malformed face of Midoriya Izuku clinging to him desperately, unwilling to let him go without an answer to a question he's always wanted to ask his idol. Let go of me. Your fanaticism is too much. He began trying to shove off the pathetic child with one hand in midair. If I let go now, I'll die. He cried, trying to speak through the winds that made the blowing skin on his face look goofily terrifying. And he did have a point. That's true. The hero suddenly realized and stopped shoving him. I have a lot of things I want to ask you directly. Okay. I get it, so close your eyes and mouth. Midoriya obliged to All Might's suggestion and even put his face down against his leg to brace himself. Perhaps feeling a little sympathetic, the hero held on to the back collar of his school uniform to keep him secure. It was then he turned his head and coughed quietly into his fist, a drop of blood escaping through his smiling teeth. He was running out of time. His facade was almost up. He made a quick landing on a skyscraper so he at least wouldn't be seen when his time was up. That was scary, Midoriya whimpered, his body quivering once again from the aftershock of such speed and power. Good grief. If you talk to the people downstairs, I'm sure they'll let you down. I seriously am out of time, so I really must go. He had to go. He had to leave now. He couldn't let a kid see who he really was. It was still a secret. He wasn't ready to stop being a hero yet. There was so much he still had to do. Wait, Midoriya tried to get him to spare just a few moments. No, I will not wait. But, no, he couldn't leave yet. He wouldn't give up. It didn't matter what his mother said. It didn't matter what that doctor said. It didn't matter what Bakugo said. It only matters. Can someone without a quirk be like you? The question made All Might stop in his tracks, smile still strong on his face as he looked back at the boy. The student was blushing, standing tall but timidly, eyes closed, but with a tone so hopeful. So hopeful. Without a quirk? The pro muttered before a spark of pain shot through his whole body and steam erupted from his skin. He hunched over, mumbling a slew of profanities. Midoriya could only look down, oblivious to what was happening in front of him. He spoke softly and rubbed his thumb nervously, sounding ready to tear up at any moment. It might have been because I don't have a quirk, but I'm always made fun of. Maybe that's why. I don't know. But I think saving people is super cool. Saving people with a fearless smile. I want to be the greatest hero, like you. He looked up to his hero with an innocent smile, only to see a cloud of steam dispersing to reveal a shriveled-up skeleton of a man with similar features to the great hero that was just standing before him. Midoriya, once again, screamed in complete fear, shock, and disbelief. Why you're deflating? Wait, up until now. Huh. A fake. You're so skinny. There was no way. There was no possible way that this was his hero. The strong, powerful, smiling man that was his hero could not possibly be this skinny man. I am All Might. The man grumbled, only to have blood leak from his mouth, causing the child to only scream louder. It was truly a terrifying sight for him. No way. He couldn't believe this. This couldn't be his hero. It was then that the weak man took a seat on the ground. He began explaining so much about himself. Maybe not everything, but enough to make this boy understand the severity of the situation. The fight that was kept out of the public. But with who? The deflation of his body was just a means of flexing. But what was the source? His quirk was kept a secret from the public. But what? He did indeed have fear, as all heroes do. But why did he never tell anyone? Why did it suddenly feel like this hero was a lie? Were his dreams a lie too? No, maybe even someone as strong as he still had faith in quirkless people. Pros are always risking their lives. I cannot simply say you can become a hero even without power. There was a snap in the air. Realization. Crushing. Hopelessness. It hit Midoriya Izuku in a single moment. Doctors, his mother, his classmates, and now, his hero. No, not his hero. There was no hope for him to be a hero. There was nothing at all for him to hold on to. There was no future. What was he even thinking? It all seemed so pointless now. Pointless. Was there a point to anything he was doing? A point to anything he was learning? His notebook, all his notes, analyses, his passion, what was the point? The merch collection, the studying, the focus on heroes, the understanding of quirks, there was no point to it. There was no matter in anything he had been doing his entire life. There was no purpose. There was no point to his purpose. Dive off the roof. Out of politeness alone, Midoriya Izuku smiled shakily with a dull look in his eyes. No longer shining with innocence, no more laughter to be had. No more light to be seen in now Brunswick green irises. I see, it's all he said. It's all he could say. He didn't see. He saw nothing. There was nothing to see ahead or to look forward at. If you want to help others, then you could become a police officer. They're often teased because they get villains delivered to their doorstep, but that is also a fine occupation. It's not a bad dream. But you also have to consider what's realistic, young man. All Might parted with those as his final words, walking off the roof through a door to lower floors. He patted his leg and felt the villain in the soda bottle still attached to his leg. He still had to deliver him to the police too. How incredible that he never dropped it during that whole ordeal. Dive off the roof. Midoriya stood silently on the top of that building for quite a long time. Not this roof. Not now. He held his notebook close as he waited until he was certain that that imposter of a hero was gone. He made his way down as discreetly as he could be. He was eventually caught by a security guard and led to the main exit where he was lectured about being on the roof and how dangerous it was. He stood there, an empty stare was all that prevalent on his freckled face as this nobody went on and on. He did not defend himself. He didn't even mention anything to do with All Might. Yes, sir. Never again, sir. It was an accident, sir. Empty words were all he had left. Shouldn't you be in school? Or shouldn't you be at home with your parents? You kids are getting so rebellious these days. The security guard grumbled before walking away back into the building. Midoriya's feet dragged so slowly down the streets, All Might's words echoing in his head. There was no hidden meaning to be found. He meant every word that he said. There was no heroism in his future. So what was left for his future? Saving people? People expected nothing of him now. The most normal people expected nothing and the greatest people expected nothing. What should he expect now? As he walked and walked, he wasn't finding his way home. He found himself trudging back to school. The skies began to get cloudy despite it being a clear day almost all day. Maybe in a place not so far away, a hero so strong was able to change the weather. The gloomy clouds were so low, bringing only darkness and then rain. How fitting for his mood. Dive off the roof. How did he get here? On the roof of his very own middle school, he looked over the edge that was several stories up. Plenty high enough. He never noticed where he had walked. Perhaps he didn't even care enough. He didn't have much to care about honestly. In my next life, he mumbled. Hope for a quirk in his next life, that's all he could do now, wasn't it? I wish, for the strongest quirk of them all. He was so ready. The emptiness he felt was reflected in his darkened eyes. It was all he felt. It only took a little lean forward and one little step. There must have been at least a single tear on his cheek, but it was hard to tell from the rain. There was no somebody this time. There was no hero, no All Might to come save the day. He was going to fall. The wind rushed past his fluffy hair when a sudden two arms hugged on tightly to his waist from behind and caught him before he could even drop an inch. Shudo! Get back, don't you dash! A loud, booming voice erupted from inside a luxurious mansion on that gloomy, rainy evening. Todoroki Shudo quickly snatched a hoodie and slid on shoes without tying the laces before racing out the front door just as he was being yelled at. Just get away. It's all he wanted. He slammed the front door shut and before his father could open it, he froze it shut and then left many layers of ice on his side to keep number 2 hero Endeavor from melting it right away. He didn't have goal location in mind. He just needed to get out and as far away as he could. An argument got out of control, sparring that had gone too far, training that had gotten too much. It all piled up that one afternoon and he needed to leave. Blood staining the inside of his right sleeve, his skin blistered at his hands. With the hoodie zipped up to his neck and hood over his head, there were likely many more wounds hidden that he did not want attention for. Shoving past people on crowded sidewalks, he obeyed his body desire to just run and keep running. He was no coward. But enough was enough, and knowing his opponent was too strong for him, he didn't have a choice. He was not safe in that mansion, no matter how pampering it must seem. It seems everything in his life had gone so wrong. Where did his family go? Where was the nurturing mother he loved? Where was his sister at a time like this? Where was Natuso? There was someone else too. Someone he couldn't remember clearly. There was another brother. Who was he? Where did he go? What was his name? He would never know how long he ran that evening. But he found himself safely able to rest on a bench near a middle school he's never seen before. With his hood up, he leaned back and looked exhaustedly at the raining sky. Tired, he mumbled quietly. His eyes blinked slowly from exhaustion. Frost was lightly coating the bottom of his right cheek, and a burn wound was revealed at the left side of his neck. His quirk was tired, his legs were tired, he was tired. He had half a mind to take a nap right where he sat. All this, to be just like him, he muttered. To be like his father, absolutely not. To be like All Might. To be strong and skilled enough to save hundreds of people. That's all he wanted out of his godforsaken quirk. There was no pride and no joy in being strong. He didn't need power to want to save people like his mother or anyone else in his family. He wanted to be strong with just his ice anyhow. Surely that was enough to surpass Endeavor and All Might. I fucking hate you, Todoroki whispered, holding his left hand up and palm open to the rain, blocking the rain from his face. Blood dripped down his hand and wrist with the cool water soothing all the burns that were hidden under that sleeve. I'll save more people than you ever did. I'll save more than you've hurt. He certainly was determined with a future to fight for. But it was then he noticed something as he sat up. He rubbed the scar on his left eye and noticed something on top of the school. Someone was up there, and even though it was a bit hard to see, he could recognize an empty gaze like that anywhere. Surely he's had it himself before too. Somebody was up there. Somebody needed help. And somebody needed to help. He slowly got up from his seat, giving himself a moment to be sure. It was someone his age, shorter. So it wasn't maintenance or a custodian, and it was past after school hours by now. They were so close to the edge, he knew he had to be fast. Using his ice, he neglected using any stairs and instead used his ice to shoot himself up the side of the building and land cleanly on the roof. He ran even though he was still so tired from all the running he had done before. Save you. Let me save you. He watched the boy before him lean forward and take a step off the roof. Let me be a hero. He couldn't reach the boy's hands. He wouldn't be able to get a good grip on his shoulders or ankles. The only thing he could think to do was wrap his arms around his waist and pull him back just a foot or two. Midoriya stared at his feet and the ground that was now below them. He took notice of the two arms wrapped tightly around his waist, holding him back in case he would try again. But he did not resist. He stayed limply in the strong arms around him with the empty gaze on his face, although silent tears fell from his eyes. It was then he was carefully let down by the stranger behind him. He was going to be lectured again, right? He was going to be made fun of now, wasn't he? He was expecting it. But instead, this young wannabe hero stepped around him to try and stand a little bit in front of him. His eyes were narrow and hateful, although that hate was not for him. And somehow he knew that. Hey, what was that? The taller boy asked quietly. His tone was calm and soft, yet it was deep and mature even though they were about the same age. Midoriya was older than him, shockingly. He didn't receive an answer. Midoriya didn't even glance up at him as he continued to stare blankly at his bright red shoes. Todoroki, however, was not one to push. Instead, he reached for Midoriya's wrist and gave him a little tug to get him to follow. As they walked, Todoroki found his grip slip into the smaller boy's hand, but he thought nothing of it. He led him to the door to a lower floor only to find it was locked from the inside. Inefficient, he grumbled. He looked around for possibly another door, but there was none to be found, and it was only beginning to rain harder. So instead he led the suicidal boy to a different ledge of the roof. "Think you can hold on to me?" he asked. Once again he didn't receive an answer. but with his right hand he placed it on the ledge to create a slide made completely of ice that would provide a safe departure to the ground. He took his hand back from Midoriya and instead put an arm around his waist to hold him close to make sure he didn't fall on accident of all things. Though he was a bit relieved to feel the freckled boy hold on his hoodie. In doing so, he noticed his hero flinched at the light grasp on his left shoulder. He's hurt. Making it down safely to the grass, Todoroki melted the ice to erase the trace of quirk use in public without a license. The taller boy did notice that the smaller didn't let go of him right away. He didn't let go of him at all. The rain was rather cold, so it was likely the subtle warmth of his left side that he was clinging to. "Hey, you can dash," Todoroki began to say before the freckled boy finally said something with a very quiet voice. "You're hurt," he said so softly, almost too soft to even hear. "Don't leave yet," he pleaded while slowly letting go and going back into the school, though he was followed just in case he tried to jump out a window or something. Midoriya lifelessly wandered towards the school's infirmary. The doors were locked and that frustrated him, to the point where he kicked the door as hard as he could. This aggression, he wasn't usually like this. Taking a moment to regain slight composure, he took his yellow bag off his shoulders and put it on the ground. Going through it, he found a safety pin and took off an all-might pin from his pencil bag, and with those, he got on one knee to try and pick the lock. When did he learn how to pick locks? He's seen it done in movies and cartoons, but how did he know how to? What was compelling enough to make him break into the school infirmary? This boy that prevented him from killing himself that has barely spoken to him was somehow motivating him to do this. Todoroki watched him curiously and then saw the door open. He followed the student inside and watched him start picking through drawers and cabinets looking for tools and basic medical things. "Why were you up there?" Todoroki attempted to ask again, but still kept his tone distant. "I finally saw reality. That everything I believed in was a lie," Midoriya opened up at last. He stopped rummaging through the nurse's things and just leaned against the cabinets while on his knees, his freckled cheek pressed against the cold wood. "The guy I looked up to more than anyone told me I could never be a hero without power. But he was a lie too. He's not a real hero either. And I know that things from a fake shouldn't matter, but it's more complicated than that. I mean, how could a lie like him make such an impact on people? How can someone feel good lying to everyone who looks up to you? But he's not stupid, so what he said is realistic." He didn't even hesitate to answer. It's like he didn't think about the answer at all. "I mean, you don't need a quirk to be great, right? Quirkless people are just as good as people with quirks. But people with quirks seem to always forget how good they have it." And he caught himself amidst his typical muttering, though instead of detailed analysis, it was desperation to understand and accept what had happened this afternoon. But he was realizing that he was projecting a lot of anger and hatred all of a sudden. Midoriya wasn't used to being like this. And yet it didn't feel unnatural. However, he realized that he was talking to someone who used their quirk to help him off the roof of the building. Out of all people, he didn't want to offend the one who was listening to him right now. I am sorry, I didn't mean." He suddenly realized his rudeness and tried to apologize, but Todoroki didn't seem all that mad. If anything, he took the hood off over his head so his face and hair could be seen better. All the hatred he projected was also cracking with sadness. He could see it. "No. I get it. Heroes aren't really that great. And they can take their powers for granted. And power as in, not just their quirks," he said in a low tone, glaring at his left arm. Midoriya didn't quite understand what he was thinking, but he found his very presence to be soothing. Both of them were angry, but so sad at the same time. Midoriya took a closer look at the boy that had sat down in one of the chairs to watch him. It was only a few seconds longer when he at last found bandages and antibacterial creams. "I mean, what kind of hero does this to someone who's supposed to be their son?" Todoroki said bitterly with a dark look and unzipped his white hoodie to reveal his left hand, wrist, arm, shoulder, and part of his neck burned, blistered, and bloodied. He glared at the wounds, angry that he'd let this happen, but also that his father did it in the first place. And for the sake of their public image, it's not like the others are going to challenge him and call him out, he growled. "Sometimes I think it would just be better if I was quirkless. I hate that I have one that's like his." Midoriya listened and shuffled over to try and clean up the blood and soothe the blisters and burns with ointments he found around and read the labels. I guess heroes kinda suck, huh? He mumbled as a smile began to tug at his lips. Suddenly, he didn't feel as sad anymore. Talking with this red and white-haired boy was therapeutic, as someone who was quirkless and someone who hated their quirk both had similar distastes towards hero society. Yeah. But Todoroki wanted to be a hero, but why again? Was it to surpass All Might and his father? Why did he save this boy even though no one was watching? I want to be a hero. But the kind that just makes people feel better, at ease. And you don't need to rely on power for that all the time. To make people feel at ease. Protecting people from villains is important, but also saving people like Midoriya was just as important to him. Midoriya had begun to wrap up Todoroki's wrist and work his way up to his shoulder carefully. You'll make a great hero, he said softly, without even thinking. Everything about this person he just met felt so genuine to him. There was no smile or blatant muscle. There was no monologue of morals or false promises of protection. He had human emotions. He found himself gazing at his scarred face for a few moments, maybe even a few moments too long. He looked so soft but so strong, blemished with a scar but still beautiful. Beautiful? He found himself blushing when he saw the bicolored eyes make eye contact with him and went back to focusing on his arm. I think even without a quirk, Todoroki began, looking down at this freckled boy. I think you can still make a big impact on people. On heroes too. It was then that there was another spark in a single moment. An impact. But he could still make an impact. On heroes. Go past analyses. Go past studying. Go past note-taking. He glanced at his notebook that was on the tile floor. All those notes. All that work. But why would that information need to stay on paper? He knows a ton about any public hero from news, from observations, from forums, wikis, logical analysis. Those notes, the hero's strengths that make them inspirational and cool? No weaknesses. Weaknesses. Midoriya's lips trembled, but not from withheld sobs. It was laughter. So much light had come to his eyes. But not a light of innocent hope and cheer. The green in his irises nearly glowed with a minty light as a smile began twitching on his face. Why, you think so? Someone as strong as you? He asked, getting the bandages up to his shoulder. Todoroki simply nodded. Yeah. I do think so. His voice was so cool and collected. Did Midoriya love it? Maybe a little. But an impact. He wanted to make an impact on this boy too. He subtly wrapped his arms around Todoroki's neck and hugged him tightly and rested his chin on his shoulder. This boy, this hero, he saved him from killing himself. But he saved his future too. Thank you. Thank you so much, he said with a big crooked smile and brightly glowing eyes. Todoroki was taken aback by the hug, surprised by it as he had not had one in such a long time. Never by someone his age either. It felt so foreign, but it would be a lie to say that he disliked it. He would have hugged back, but by the time he got one hand on Midoriya's back, the freckled boy had pulled away and put his hands on his shoulders. Hey, the hero who hurt you like this. You said it was your parent, your father? Asked the freckled boy, tilting his head to the side just a little bit. The hero that hurt his hero. Someone like that deserves to die, not me. Todoroki only nodded, a bit baffled by Midoriya's new expression. The boy who had nothing but an empty gaze now looked at him with a kind of enthusiasm, curiosity, and mischief he had never seen before. It didn't frighten him, he was just too unsocialized to understand. Who is he? Midoriya demanded. He'll get all the notes he can on him. He'll find every weakness. He'll make sure they get to an enemy, and he'll make sure to repay the beautiful boy in front of him for his kindness and for giving him a new reason to live. Endeavor, Todoroki answered, almost as if in a trance, allured by the glowing shade of the eyes in front of them. Such a cute, freckled face, but with such hypnotizing eyes, he had caught every fiber of his attention. Midoriya quickly let go and began to put away the things he had borrowed to patch up his hero and washed his hands. Before Todoroki could grab his hoodie, the smaller boy began rubbing detergent that he found on the fabric where the blood was stained. With a little bit of bleach and rubbing, the stain was hardly noticeable, even when inside out. Thank you for all of this, the taller boy was sure to say as they began to walk out together, but not without Midoriya stealing 2 books and shoving them into his bag while the other's back was turned. Thank you too for everything, he said with a small smile and his head lowered a bit. I should get home. My mom must be freaking out by now, he giggled a bit too. As the two walked out, they saw it was still raining. And before Midoriya took a step forward, he felt something being draped over his head. Here, you can have this? Todoroki gave his hoodie to Midoriya to at least keep him dry in the rain. But your bandages. Todoroki shook his head at even the beginning of a protest. No, don't worry. You can keep it. You've had a pretty shit day. And thus Midoriya would be seen walking back home, even going through the tunnel he had been attacked in earlier again. Todoroki's hoodie was a bit big on him from how much taller he was, but it was keeping him dry. But it was also so warm. The power to create ice and melt it, number 2 hero Endeavor's son. Ice and fire. He nuzzled his nose near the zipper that was up as high as it could go. An amazing quirk, he mumbled. He wasn't made fun of or looked down on for being quirkless for once in his life. How lucky he had been to meet someone so kind. On a day as depressing and crushing as this, he was walking like a new person, all thanks to one boy who still wanted to be a hero. If only he knew that he just inspired one of the worst villains. Wait, Midoriya said to himself, stopping halfway through the tunnel. I don't even know his name, he cried out, gripping his hood and gritting his teeth in childish rage. I can't believe I never asked his name. I'll see him again, right? He looked down at his hands with a quivering smile. I have to see him again. I have to save him. He'll get his name eventually, surely. On coming back home, Midoriya was greeted with a tight hug from his mother's sobbing waterfalls and bombarded with questions as to why he was home so late, where the hoodie came from, why he was covered in bruises, and even more. Midoriya told only half-truths to let the events of that go under the rug and be left unknown to her. As far as she knew, he had a run-in with a villain while with some others and got a bit dirty, but someone lent him a hoodie to get through the rain and got distracted at a comic book store on his way home. There was no All Might or red and white-haired boy mentioned, and there was no mention of even getting close to a roof. He was still her quirkless little boy with innocent hopes and dreams. As school had taken a break for the semester, it left all the teenagers with plenty of free time. While many were training their quirks to apply and get into UA, others had to utilize other skills to be successful in the ever-changing society, and some were slacking around enjoying the leisure time they had. Midoriya would spend his afternoons and evenings at home, stuck on his computer scrounging every forum for information on any heroes. His notebooks had all been redone. What had been a fanboy's cherished series of encyclopedias was now a collection of hit lists. Of course, he could never use these notes personally, but it would only motivate him to go out and make connections with those who could. He would pretend to go to sleep at sundown, snuggling close to the white hoodie given to him by his only hero. But once it passed midnight, he threw on a black hoodie and pants with his favorite red shoes and went out in the city. Truly, it was not the safest idea for a quirkless teenager to go out at night to the sketchiest parts of the city, but he felt almost comforted by it. Purchasing some spray paint at an art store also provided him with plenty of entertainment. The atmosphere was altering what had been such a sweet boy into a small-time rule breaker, alienating himself from normal teenage society. Going out to the arcade or karaoke with friends was nowhere in his life. He had no friends. Striving to impress a girl he had a crush on, there was no girl in his life to admire. The only person his age he truly had positive relationships with was the boy that saved his life, and he didn't even know his name. He had no desire to partake in a part-time job. Just using his notes and getting revenge on the heroes that lied and hurt him was all he had to care about now. But sometimes focusing on one thing could get a bit boring, so he resulted in mild vandalism and sometimes even arson. Setting garbage or abandoned buildings on fire was a weekly thing, and spray painting anti-hero phrases on walls or even making amateur art was becoming a hobby. His note-taking was a top priority, however. Getting any dirt or information on All Might and Endeavor was his main focus above all else. His mother had found out about his sneaking out, but it appeared that he never came back hurt. And he always did come back, so maybe he just liked going for nightly walks. She never confronted him about it. One night, deep in the autumn season, brisk yet clear, Midoriya sat near a dumpster writing in a notebook and watching the phrase "Heroes Lie" with All Might's hair shape dry on the wall in front of him. He was drinking a soda casually and enjoying a typical night out. The page he was working on was that of Mount Lady. What had been complimenting notes were either erased or crossed out and rewritten with potential weak spots and personality flaws that could be used against her at any point. In the corner of each page was also a list of potential blackmail that could ever be used. He tapped his lip with his pen before flipping pages to find his sketch of Endeavor. He glared at it and darkened words he had already written. The characters of child abuse was bolded darkly again and again in the sections he kept for blackmail. "I'll save him," he whispered to himself. It's been weeks since he's tried to kill himself, but Todoroki was still fresh on his mind. "That's some pretty nice work you got there," another voice said from above Midoriya. The surprise viewer spooked the freckled boy and even made him jump as he looked up at the scrawny figure that stood over him. Bright red eyes stared down at him with a mess of blue hair barely framing the top half of his face. But he couldn't see his face because there was a severed hand over it. Was it real? Was it fake? He couldn't tell by how stiff and discolored it looked. This stranger, too, wore all black and red shoes, but they weren't high tops. And this man was older than him, but not by too much. Thanks?" Midoriya stuttered. Something felt very odd about this new stranger, nothing like Todoroki. This new stranger sat down right next to Midoriya and looked over his shoulder, getting uncomfortably close for comfort. Was personal space just not a thing for him? Then Midoriya noticed the red eyes glance up at his tag work on the wall in front of them. "Not a Big Hero fan, huh?" he asked with a cheery tone. He tilted his head to get an even better view of the notebook as the freckled boy flipped to a page that was more filled out than Endeavor's. Such aggressive penmanship, scratched out compliments and entire pages had been ripped out only to be remade. "Looks like a hit list," the stranger commented before giggling and pointing at Midoriya mockingly. "Someone like you couldn't possibly take heroes like that on." Midoriya's face blushed with anger and embarrassment. Someone else making fun of him for being quirkless already? "Yeah, and what can a twig like you dash?" He was ready to snap back and stand up for himself for once when the stranger wrapped his arm around his shoulders and hugged him close to his shoulder. "Not yet. And not by yourself," the red-eyed stranger added with a promising tone, but it only made the boy freeze. "But is someone like you really serious about this kind of thing? You really want to see these guys die?" The stranger then reached with his other hand to find the pages that were All Might's. Midoriya could see by just the shape of his eyes that he was smiling. "Can a little schoolboy like you stomach something like that? Watching heroes die." It was this edgy teenager's new goal, wasn't it? To end Endeavor and All Might and other heroes that brag and boast blessed talent? Is that what he really wanted? This wasn't a game anymore, and it was becoming more than a dream. People were going to die and people were going to get killed. Midoriya could tell by the aura the man holding on to him was giving off. Has he killed people before? Will he kill him if he gives the wrong answer? He couldn't read his actions at all. His thoughts were but a mystery because he couldn't tell if this was a lie too. "You don't have to answer right away," the stranger then said, having recognized the long silence between the two. He could tell he was making this boy think, and that was enough for him. "I'm around. And you seem to be around too." The man then reached for the soda can that was on the ground beside Midoriya on the opposite side. He held it with his pinky finger up for some reason. "Whatever you're thinking about and whatever those notes are about, we could make that happen." He waved the can around a bit in a circular motion. It was catching the attention of the silent freckled child. "I hate lots of things, you know? I want to make everything I hate disappear. And I can make the things you hate disappear too." He then snickered as the can in hand turned to dust when his fifth finger touched it. He was casual to stand back up and stretch a bit. "See ya around, little schoolboy." He half waved, putting his hands in his hoodie pocket and walking off deeper down the alleyway. Midoriya was left quivering, wide-eyed, and at a loss of words. That man was so close. He was sitting right next to him, arm around him. He could have killed him right there if he wanted to. "Deepening," he stuttered quietly, gripping his neck just to feel that it was still there after being so close to death. His heart raced, beating out of his chest. His blood was pumping from the anxiety of the threat that was just there and now casually walking away. A man so scrawny, creepy-looking, and yet shamelessly evil was right there in front of him. An enemy of heroes. He could only think of the pretty boy he met on that school roof, the only hero he wanted to save from a terrible pro-hero. It was his chance. It was his chance to save him. This little schoolboy began to smile. "Wait," he called out, reaching out for the red-eyed stranger who stopped at his words. "I'm quirkless. I don't have any power. I'm not strong or fast or flexible or anything like that." But what? Midoriya frantically flipped through a page in his notebook. The very last page that was sketched with the anatomy of a human that he had copied out of the books he stole from the school infirmary. It was labeled in detail with questions written all over the page about the human body and how quirks affect it. He held it up to this villainous stranger with a twitching smile on his freckled face. "I want to learn. I want to know these heroes, inside and out. If I learn anything, I'll always let you know. I'll let you know any physical or social weakness. I can be useful somehow, right?" Give him this chance. It's all he could ask for. And the stranger turned halfway to him, looking at the page from a distance and looking at the face of the trembling teenager. He merely scoffed and shrugged his shoulders. "I'll see if I can figure something out for you eventually." And that's all he had left to say before leaving completely. Night after night, Midoriya went back to that specific spot hoping for the red-eyed stranger. But after the first week, it came to his attention that maybe he wanted to meet somewhere different in case he was being watched or followed. Someone like that has to have lots of enemies, right? That's the only explanation as to why he hadn't come back. Or maybe he was just busy, but surely he would have made the time to come back. That man didn't give up on him too, did he? Maybe he shouldn't have told him that he was quirkless. No, he definitely had to. Anything that came off as a lie or hiding something, someone like that would kill him in an instant. So the little schoolboy began tagging different walls around the city's underbelly with more of that same phrase he wrote that night. Heroes lie. It can at least be a sign that the teenager was still out and about. He wasn't hiding or running away from this opportunity. His desperation became so intense that he even began asking people in the alleys if they've seen someone in a black hoodie with a hand on his face. It was unwanted attention and unsafe, but he just had to find him again if he wanted to save Todoroki. It was just past the first week when he was leaving another signature tag on a small hero agency. "Come on, how many of these do you need to find?" he grumbled, getting annoyed at this point. He shook the can a bit, getting more pressure to build up when he felt someone grab the hood of his hoodie and lift him off his feet. He dropped the can in surprise and began kicking his feet. "So you're the little brat that's been leaving those all over the place." It wasn't the one he was looking for. But even still, he was caught red-handed. If his mother found out about this, or if the schools he's applied to, or if the stranger figures out how pathetic he is at being a mild delinquent. "Let me down," it was all he could say even though it would do nothing. He was found out, deer in the headlights. "Heroes lie, huh? That's a lot of disrespect from someone like you." The hero began to lecture and Midoriya just covered his ears and kept flailing to get out of this basic prose grip. He wasn't as big as All Might or Endeavor and his costume wasn't flashy at all. There was no way he was even in his entire collection of notebooks. He wasn't about to listen to anything this guy had to say. No more lectures. No more being told what he can't or shouldn't do. "Shut up," he cried out, just not wanting to hear anything heroes had to say. "Shut up. Shut up." He kicked back and nailed the heel of his shoe into his groin, making the hero flinch and grit his teeth. His grip loosened and Midoriya was on his feet once again. But it only took the second he landed for the hero to tackle him to the ground and forced his face into the dirt below them. Little kids like you try so hard to be different and say things just for attention. Slandering heroes like this, do you realize how hard they work to protect people like you and your friends? The hero continued. Midoriya still struggled, looking for any way to escape. His arms flailed, but he had no flexibility to try and hit the man on top of his back. But it was then that something shimmering caught his eye. A broken glass bottle in the shadow of a trash can was just an inch or two from his reach. "Are you listening to me? Think about how immature you're being. Don't you think that we deserve a little respect for our hard work protecting you? Have we earned that much? This hero seemed personally offended by this freckled teenager's tagged words. But that meant nothing to him now. You people haven't earned jack from me. You don't even know me. The green-haired boy said through gritted teeth as his face was pressed further into the dirt. He just kept reaching for the light of that glass bottle. It seemed like such excessive force to be used against someone so small and quirkless. Having a flashy costume and a title doesn't mean anything. Being a hero doesn't mean you're the good guy. Midoriya tapped the top of the bottle to make it shift just a little bit until he could get the skinny end in his entire hand. People that think they deserve good things just because they're born with power need to disappear. With nothing but luck, the teenager closed his eyes and swung the bottle back and prayed that it would hit the hero. And it did. It hit the man on the forehead where he at least wore a helmet, but the shattered glass still was able to cut up and stab his face. What the hell? The hero once again had to back off and cover his face as a shard had gotten into one of his eyes. Midoriya scurried out from under him and picked up another chunk of glass that was on the ground and held it up in defense. Now he's done it. There's no getting out of this without trouble. The hero was on his knees holding his eye with blood dripping all over his face from smaller cuts. Look what you did, the man cried out, showing the freckled teenager his eye that had been slit by the glass with the piece still lodged inside of it. It made the teen flinch at the painful sight and fluids were dripping out of it. I didn't mean to? Not a chance. Instead, the corner of Midoriya's lips began to twitch up in a smirk. Look what this little quirkless boy did. The hero underestimated him and now he was half blind. He snuck up on him thinking he could take him on just because he was some hero. He began to giggle because the thought of it was hilarious. How terribly, horrifyingly ironic. Who needed a quirk to feel powerful? He brought a hero to his knees with the use of nothing but glass garbage. His giggle grew to a laugh as he just pointed at the bleeding hero with a bright glow in his green eyes. Look what I did. You can barely see, he mocked, finally being the one able to do that. His body was shaking with euphoria. This feeling was so new, so intoxicating. The hero was paralyzed by his shock of how this young teenager was so pleased by his suffering. How cruel someone was at such a young age. He reached forward with his arm quickly growing and extending, trying to grab the freckled boy yards away from him. It was his quirk. He just had to restrain this young lunatic in the making. Midoriya flinched and was about to turn to run before the hero's extended hand grabbed the back of his throat. It suddenly let go. He looked back to see a scrawny figure in black behind the hero, or at least, where the hero used to be. The man that had just been half-blinded had suddenly turned to nothing but dust on the ground. The hero was dead. Gone in just a single moment. Midoriya hadn't even seen the man himself disappear, just the dust remains and a pool of blood from where he once knelt. He couldn't say anything, unable to find the words to say even though the one he's been looking for was right in front of him. The red-eyed stranger with the hand on his face walked right on through the puddle of blood to Midoriya while the boy was frozen before him. He strolled over to him, hunched over a bit to get to eye level, and got a little too close to his face again. You good? He asked vaguely. He only received a gulp and a nod as an answer. He dead? Midoriya asked very quietly, not breaking the little eye contact he had with the hues between the finger gaps. He just wanted to be sure. Yeah, was all the hooded man said. After that, Midoriya broke eye contact to look at the blood again. So this guy was a murderer after all. Considering how easily and quickly he got rid of that hero, he's done this plenty of times before. It was difficult to fully process because of how quick the hero was gone, but Midoriya had such a sick pleasure of watching him be in pain. The man's eyes changed shape to represent he was smiling under that hand. You still want to do what you said? He asked cheekily. Learn heroes inside and out? Midoriya nodded twice. The first time was slow and shaky, but after he shut his eyes tight his motion was more confident. Then come on. Midoriya was lightly nudged on the shoulder to follow this random guy he met in an alley in the middle of the night and just killed someone. And as they walked, Midoriya was next to this man but a pace behind him. Where were they going? Was it going to be safe? Was anyone else going to be there? He had spent all time looking for this killer, and now that he was with him, he felt himself getting nervous like the night they met. Shigaraki Tamura. That's what you can call me. How about you, little schoolboy? The hooded figure called Shigaraki finally revealed himself. Midoriyuum? Aizuku. Did he forget his own name? He stuttered, saying his own name. How embarrassing. He must look like a timid idiot. Shigaraki had been looking directly ahead until he asked for his new little acquaintance. He quickly noticed how nervous he was getting all of a sudden. He was a teenager growing up, he could tell that much. But this boy was clearly coming out of typical citizen life. He was walking into a life he's never seen or been a part of before. Did he feel bad for him? Maybe. Not pity or sympathy, but he felt something. This kid just looked pathetic to him. But he was willing to give this pathetic, stuttering boy a chance. This wasn't a mistake, right? Was he wrong to put faith in this random kid he met on the streets? He lightly scratched at his neck without thinking about it. Shigaraki took Midoriya to a building in the backmost streets of the most compressed part of the city. It was about 3 stories tall and looked pretty average on the outside. Do you live here? Midoriya asked as they were coming around to a side door. It was a bit hard to see with the lack of light in the area. Kinda? What could that possibly mean? Did he, or did he not live in this weird place in the middle of the city? Maybe he was just squatting here. He looked shaggy enough to live in a sketchy place like this. But in going through the door and having it shut lightly behind him, he found himself inside a bar with no one else except a man made of dark fog standing behind a counter. I'm back, Kurogiri. It's the kid I was telling you about. Shigaraki grumbled, stretching his neck from side to side without cracking it. Midoriya looked around curiously, trying to get a feel for the place. It was very neat with bottles behind the bar very neatly aligned, a big TV on a brick wall, lots of swivel stools to sit on, and a single red sofa against the wall. Not some big torture dungeon or decked-out armory as he may have expected for a little bit. It just looked like a typical bar. The dark fog guy, named Kurogiri, was even dressed like a bartender, so he must just be the owner. What was up with this Shigaraki guy? What was he hoping to accomplish? Shigaraki took a seat at one of the stools at the bar. Get comfortable, he said casually, taking out his phone and just scrolling through it for a few seconds while Midoriya sat on the sofa in a stiff posture. What was he thinking? What was he planning? Was this a trap? There was so much he didn't know yet. This suddenly seemed like a bad idea. I'm trying to set something up here. I want to create a powerful team. Shigaraki began, glancing up at the freckled boy and then going back to look at his phone, his foot resting on his knee and his elbow on the counter. A League of Villains kind of thing. I want power. I want numbers too. But even then, a tight, well-crafted party would make for the greatest chance of success against our final boss. He showed his phone screen the boy who was listening intently. He showed him a picture of All Might in his fake form in a news article. I want to destroy Hero Society. But I want to destroy All Might more than anything. And you're going to help me do that. That's what you want too, right? To destroy Hero Society? What was that even supposed to mean? Shigaraki was so vague, it just left Midoriya with even more questions. And yet he felt that they were things that could be answered with time. It was only a matter of whether he was going to give Shigaraki and this Kurogiri guy his time and limited skills. He didn't have that much to offer them, right? But it seemed he was the first to be invited to this well-crafted party. This was a whole new world he was jumping into. He wouldn't be able to live like the rest of the kids he went to school with anymore if he was going to team up with this murderer. And yet, all he could think about was All Might's lies and then Todoroki. The thought of seeing that beautifully kind boy, ensnared and trapped by his father's shadow and getting caught up in a world of liars and arrogance, it filled him with a sense of rage. I do want that, he said as his posture loosened and his head lowered to look up, yet straight at Shigaraki. I want to destroy someone other than All Might, but I want him gone too. Don't get me wrong. He wanted that monster of a liar out of the public eye so people don't get their hopes up like fools as he did. But there's someone I want dead. The number 2 hero below him. I'll do anything if you can promise me they'll both disappear. He'll save Todoroki. He'll save him no matter what. He owes him nothing short of his own life and his future. Shigaraki smiled at Midoriya's conditions. Of course, he hummed, standing up again and going to an elevator door. Let me show you what you'll be doing now, little schoolboy. Midoriya went ahead and followed Shigaraki once more with much more pride in his step. He'll become something now. He'll be more than just that quirkless kid. He felt the elevator descend quite a bit, understanding that this building was far bigger than he thought. There were many more basement floors than upper ones. And when those doors opened again, Shigaraki stepped out first and turned on a light switch to show him his new purpose. Midoriya stepped through the threshold and beheld the sight that no one his age should be offered. A laboratory, supplied with surgical tools, drugs, books, torturous equipment, cages big enough to fit people in, workbenches, and 3 tables to fit and restrain people. This was a setup for human experimentation. Learning heroes inside and out. Quirkless or not, whatever you can learn and study will be of use to me, Shigaraki said, walking further in, going through a drawer, and placing a scalpel in Midoriya's hand that he grabbed and brought outward to hold it. Still holding on to his hand, he bent over to get to his eye level. Midoriya Izuku? Will you truly become a villain? He asked with the most twisted smirk underneath that hand. He was completely still, but his mind was ravaged with enthusiasm. A doctor. A healer. But also a killer. It's exactly what he needed. And with a bright green glow in his big mischievous eyes, Midoriya tilted his head up to look down at the man before him. Absolutely, Shigaraki Tamura. Midoriya would later move his nightly adventures from random alleyways to spending it in the laboratory in Kurogiri's bar. It seemed like Shigaraki was always there waiting for him, but he never said much. And during the first few nights, there wasn't anything for the villain in the making to do. There was nobody to practice with, and he debated if that was a good or bad thing. It gave him more time to look over all the tools and drugs and study them. With books to read and the internet at his fingertips, it was good preparation to figure out what he was going to be doing soon enough. And while he never interacted with Shigaraki, Kurogiri made many appearances. The first time gave Midoriya quite a fright as the dark fog man had teleported beside him, looking over his shoulder while he was at a desk reading a book. Is everything useful? The man had asked calmly, but it had scared the freckled teenager, causing him to jump and grab a syringe, holding it defensively with quivering hands. Kurogiri was shockingly polite. Apologies for scaring you. You must have been focused, he apologized. Midoriya put the needle down with an embarrassed expression and quietly looked back at the book. I've only dabbled in this kind of stuff. It's a bit overwhelming, I guess, he mumbled. Maybe he was way in over his head. He was just a teenager. He couldn't become a pro doctor for a single break and final season. There was so much to learn, memorize, and understand. This was nothing like hero notes because now it was up to his own actions instead of gushing over others. But he suddenly panicked. That doesn't mean that I'm going to ditch it all. Not after Shigaraki gave this all to me, he said, waving his hands at the man in the suit. He couldn't even risk looking like he was going to back out of this villain work now. They would probably kill him because of what he knew already. Don't let them get the wrong idea. He could do this. He told Shigaraki he would. And though he was expecting a threat from this man shrouded in darkness, he received a foggy hand on his shoulder instead. The gesture caused him to flinch but then look up with less anxiety in his system. I don't know much about this work either. I've never considered a medical field, he began, turning his head to look at the page the boy had opened on his desk. It already looks very complicated. But if you truly need help, I wouldn't mind assisting you or finding someone who can. Midoriya could only blink a few times as Kurogiri began looking more closely at the book. Shigaraki was telling me how he wanted to give you a subject right away. But I convinced him to let you build your confidence first. And in hindsight, I believe I made the correct decision. There were so many words even this grown adult couldn't understand. All these medical terms and body parts he's never heard of. It came off as intimidating to him. He found it a bit admirable that a child was stepping up to the challenge of comprehending it all. Would you like anything to help you focus? You've been down here for quite some time. He then offered before removing his hand from Midoriya's shoulder. Midoriya scratched the back of his head. Maybe some water? He asked shyly. It was then he watched Kurogiri disappear within himself as a portal for just a few moments. Dark fog teleportation, he muttered out loud, still being his little habit. And before even a minute had passed, Kurogiri had returned with a glass of water and set it down on the desk. For villains, this guy didn't seem all that bad or scary now. It made the new villain smile. Thank you. It became a ritual for a while for Kurogiri to come by the laboratory and offer food or a drink for the boy hard at work. And that boy's requests became more casual as he asked for sugary and salty snacks, fruit juices and sodas, finally getting comfortable in this new setting. At some points in the night, Midoriya would ask Kurogiri to stay for some company. There would be no talking or requests. The man would just stand there, sit at a different desk, or sometimes pick up a different book and try getting a few peeks at what the child was learning. And that child has never had a figure like this in his life before. An adult male figure that wouldn't tell him what he could or couldn't do, someone that was supporting him even if it was quiet, and someone that was letting him learn at his own pace. Interactions with Shigaraki were always brief if they weren't non-existent. He saw him when he arrived near midnight, and when he left around 6 a.m. He was always at the bar, in the same seat every time. Sometimes the counter would be covered in scattered papers, other times he was playing video games on a little TV, or be on a laptop going through odd-looking web pages, or watching the news, or on his phone, or sometimes he would just sit there with his palm on his cheek. It seemed like he never slept or he was nocturnal. He was really skinny too, so he didn't seem all that threatening until he used his quirk. But he always had that severed hand on his face. Something about that hand just seemed so strange. Does he ever take it off? Is it real? Does it do anything? Midoriya asked Kurogiri as they stood in the elevator going back up to the hub of the bar. He hugged 2 books in his arms, prepared to just take them home to continue studying diligently. Now he was more than comfortable with this dark fog man. It was the one who brought him into this villain world that seemed more the stranger. You could always ask him yourself, Kurogiri suggested, making Midoriya shake his head vigorously. If it was real, those would be very rude questions to ask. He didn't know Shigaraki well, and it felt out of place to ask someone that he was working for something along those lines. Not a chance. I don't know him like that. I think he might kill me. If he's your boss, wouldn't you think it would be easier for you to get to know him? Avoiding him won't get either of you anywhere, Kurogiri suggested. Midoriya hid his nose behind the books and looked at his feet. Get to know his boss? Have his boss get to know him? What would they tell each other? Their goals seemed so vague and their inspirations were unclear to each other. Midoriya hasn't told anyone about his dreams in full. But when it came down to it, he wanted revenge on All Might, to prove himself, and to save Todoroki. But would that be enough for Shigaraki? I would also like to know you more. I could provide more helpful assistance. Kurogiri then added, having not received an answer in over a minute. It made Midoriya's head perk up slightly. Maybe, just maybe they would help him save that beautiful boy at the middle school. The elevator doors opened and Shigaraki was sitting right where he always was. On this particular morning, he was playing a video game on a little TV that sat on the counter. It looked like a single-player game. That fact alone was enough to ruin any source of courage to approach him. He didn't seem like the social type even though he was the one that approached Midoriya in the first place. But Kurogiri gave Midoriya the slightest nudge forward as he himself went behind the bar counter to start cleaning behind it. He liked to keep things tidy. Out of all the stools to choose from, Midoriya sat on the one on Shigaraki's right side. But he awkwardly sat there in silence, not knowing what to say, what to do, or even what to think. He had many questions to ask him and wanted to know so many things, and yet it felt inappropriate to ask. What was the hand? What were his motivations? What were his plans? How many people has he killed? How did he and Kurogiri meet? Did he live here? How old was he? Did he have a family? Did he have friends? Did he have other people working for him? Why did he give him a chance? Do you feel confident enough to have your first subject? Shigaraki asked out of nowhere, but ever so casually. The question made all of Midoriya's anxious questioning thoughts disperse and focus on how to answer. Was it worth lying? He looked to Kurogiri and internally told himself it wasn't worth lying. Honesty was the best way to build a positive relationship. I don't know. I've never done this kind of stuff before. He answered honestly and began playing with his fingers. I promise that I'm not chickening out. I just want to do it right. He had yet to kill someone. He wasn't as used to this as Shigaraki must have been by now. He killed that hero without a second glance. I've never killed someone, he admitted, almost afraid of what his boss's response would be. Why wasn't he saying anything? But you want to, right? Shigaraki then said after about a minute of painful silence. Midoriya stiffened even though the red-eyed man didn't seem all that angry or offended. Why yeah, of course I do. Please don't get the wrong idea. He wasn't running away from this. He wasn't a coward. That Endeavor guy, I remember you had a grudge. Why? Shigaraki then asked, keeping his eyes on the game he was playing. This conversation started with Midoriya wanting to know more about his boss, but somehow it seemed like it was only going the other way around. And Midoriya knew Shigaraki was getting him to spill more details about himself. However, he was not opposed to it. This was a give and take, and he was taking a lot of resources from the guy sitting next to him when considering the lab and study material. He could at least return it with information now. He lowered his head and stared at his feet, remembering how, at one point, there wasn't a floor in front of them. Someone is suffering because of him. And that person did so much for me. I want to give back, he mumbled. So you're doing this for someone else? Shigaraki asked quickly. Not good. Not necessarily. I have my own issues with All Might and all his lies. He's not a real hero. He's just like everyone else. Someone like that shouldn't have that much influence. There was more than one motivation. He would be loyal, that is for certain. Figured out that heroes don't always come, huh? Shigaraki mumbled, lightly scratching at his neck while the screen on the game cut to a loading scene. It made Midoriya take notice and finally look at him. His eyes were calm but his body language expressed stress and intensity. Don't you think people are weaker when they rely on heroes? And they're so picky. I hate them. So much hate. The red hues of his eyes screamed nothing but hatred. So much hate. They get so lazy thinking heroes will take care of the world's problems. So it's not their problem anymore. They get so weak and stupid, and they don't know or care what happens when a hero doesn't come. Not until it's too late. Midoriya listened as he watched the neck scratching become more intense. There were wounds there that weren't done healing yet. He was beginning to bleed a little bit as the skin was ripping. And yet violence is only okay when heroes use it. That's not fair, wouldn't you agree? It's annoying. I hate it. Shigaraki slowly began to stop the scratching as the game continued and both his hands were drawn to the controller again. Midoriya only stared at him for another minute full of silence, trying to piece together all that he's heard. Heroes don't always come. No hero came when he was being bullied. No hero came to tell him that he could succeed. No hero came to take him off the roof. Some random kid his age did. That kid was a different kind of hero. And all that hate. He felt it too. He hated All Might, he hated Endeavor, he hated all the heroes that would never give him a chance. He hated that hero society made him destined to be weaker than everyone born with a quirk. Then the bit about violence. A hero has tackled him to the dirt, but the moment he fought back, he was in the wrong. The thought of all these things filled him with a kind of fire that made his fists clench up tightly. That person you owe. Who are they? Shigaraki then asked, seeming to have suddenly calmed down. He had a short temper but also a short cooldown. How scary, he could snap in a moment's notice. I never got his name. But he's around my age. He saved me from Dash, maybe he shouldn't tell that much. He saved me. He didn't finish his initial statement and yet Shigaraki did not question him about it. Instead, a little smirk peeked out from under the hand on his face. A crush? He suddenly teased. Just the mention of that sent Midoriya into a full blush and he slammed his hands on the table hastily. I barely know him. He talked to him for like an hour. It couldn't be something as juvenile as a crush. But you're willing to kill the number 2 hero for him. Shigaraki turned his head to place his chin in his palm and just got on all of Midoriya's nerves, even pointing at him casually. He was so immature. He must be a pretty big deal to you. Look at you, you're all embarrassed, little schoolboy. Shigaraki just ended up laughing at the poor teenager who just sat there and took it. He couldn't escape any form of bullying. But this kind didn't feel so bad. It felt fake. It was a tease, but just a tease. Whether he meant it or not, Midoriya didn't feel degraded. It's not like that, he childishly bit the inside of his cheek in a pout. When you feel like everything is ruined and have nowhere to go and it couldn't possibly get better. But someone gives that one little thing to keep you going. Does that make sense? He did his best to explain while clutching the fabric of his pants at his knees. When he finally looked at Shigaraki again, he would find him almost completely still and the game paused. The controller was still in his hands as he was staring down at it with narrowed eyes. He was quiet again. Midoriya tilted his head at him, attempting to see more of his face behind the hand to no avail. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense, he breathed at last. Midoriya listened carefully to Shigaraki's tone. It was the sound of someone that knew exactly what he was talking about. There was much more to this scrawny gamer than he could imagine. And so the two sat in silence for about a minute before Midoriya yawned and rubbed his eyes with the balls of his palms. Being busy all afternoon, evening, and night studying only gave him mornings to sleep, and it was just barely daybreak now. He got off the stool with his things and put his hood over his head. "See you tomorrow," he mumbled before going out the door back home. The next night involved more studying, as did the night after, and the night after that. And after every night he made it a habit to sit next to Shigaraki and talk with him a bit now with Kurogyari always being close by. It reached a point where Shigaraki had once offered Midoriya a second game controller to play with him instead of just watching. Conversations would dwell away from work and villain stuff and shift more towards gaming and more normal conversations. Whether it be getting into a subtle rant about difficulty spikes, glitches, or inconvenient mechanics, or going on about how society sucked, heroes sucked, teenagers sucked, or people in general sucked, the two easily formed a kind of chemistry. Midoriya still worked for Shigaraki, but it was starting to feel less and less like a boss and minion relationship. And yet it didn't feel like a teacher and mentor connection either. All Might is going to be teaching at UA this year, Shigaraki began to say as he played an adventure game with Midoriya, who had gotten a hold of the gameplay and controls by now. "You start high school in a little while, don't you?" His attention shifted from the screen to the green-haired teenager beside him, and yet he was playing masterfully without looking at what he was doing. And beside him, Midoriya sat in all black clothing as usual, but now with little dark circles beginning to form under and around his eyes. He looked to be in a constant state of tiredness these days. "Yeah. I applied to a few places. The results are supposed to come in later this week. And it was too late to take an application back. I did apply for you." He looked annoyed and frustrated with himself. Going to such a school seemed sickening to him now. Being surrounded by arrogant kids with crazy quirks and selfish drives just sounded like an actual nightmare now. He grumbled and scratched at his head. "I was so stupid. I shouldn't have done that." "Well, if you do get in, it would be pretty helpful actually," Shigaraki said, and then reached over to pull Midoriya's wrist away from his head. He was picking up on his bad habits. He's also lost some weight since coming to the bar every night to study, ignoring his nutrition for knowledge. The teenager blinked when he heard Shigaraki speak again. "Having someone on the inside of a massive school like that would save me a lot of trouble. Just think a little." Shigaraki tapped Midoriya's forehead with one finger. "Having someone on the inside of All Might's place of work. A school with high-tech security, not knowing that a villain was walking inside its very walls. He could take notes on all the pro-hero teachers. He could get information on all the students. He could map out the school more accurately. I'd be right under our enemies' noses." He mumbled with a finger curled to his chin. "The paranoia of an intruder. No one would suspect me." A small smirk was tugging at the corner of his lips. "The heroes and the students would be in the palm of my hand." How amazing that sounded. To have the heroes scrambling because of him. However, you would still need to be careful. You can't give yourself away. You'll have to play nice with all the other kids and play along with their little games. Shigaraki reminded him. That did not sound amazing. It sounded agonizing. Getting along with pompous heroes on a daily basis was something he had no desire to do. You'll have to bite your tongue, put on a smile, and use that face of yours to make them all think you're just a little fanboy. Midoriya got physically paler as he put his face on the counter a bit harshly and made a small bang. He'd rather bash his head into the wall. Multiple times. But was it truly worth it? He'd be like a little rat amongst giant monsters. And yet the idea of the massive All Might dying at his feet, realizing it was the kid he underestimated that brought him to his demise, filled him with nothing but joy. Could he pretend to be the person he used to be? I don't know if Midoriya began to lift his head up off the counter when he saw the severed hand on the counter beside him. His eyes flickered when he noticed it, and his focus quickly trailed up to Shigaraki's face. The skin around his eyes was wrinkled, dried, chipped, and cut. His lips were beyond being just chapped, and yet he had a scar on his right eye and at the corner of his mouth. No regular lotion or chapstick was going to make his face look normal. A condition maybe? Or maybe something with his quirk caused him to look so terrifyingly strange. And yet it was something about his eyes that Midoriya found alluring. They had looked so narrow and angry all the time when they were behind the severed hand's fingers. But now they seemed just a little bit softer, a little bit bigger, and a little bit brighter. Think you can do it? Shigaraki asked, looking down at him. Midoriya could only bring himself to nod. Was this his way of showing trust? He had this overwhelming feeling well up in his chest when they made eye contact. The expression in those red eyes was telling him so many things that he couldn't begin to understand. I think you can too. Shigaraki didn't put the hand back on after their short conversation. Perhaps he just felt more comfortable without it now. At least with Midoriya. And so they played a video game for a little bit longer like this. Hey, do you think the son of the number 2 hero would go to the UA? Midoriya asked, the thought suddenly coming to his mind. Would he see that boy again? Would he be there as a hero in training? Would they become enemies? I would assume so. I bet that wouldn't even have to take the test to get in. Shigaraki answered honestly. The answer made Midoriya hold the controller close to his chest and lower his head a bit. A villain and a hero, it wouldn't possibly work. Todoroki wanted to be a hero. Granted, a hero that had pure motivations. But there's no way he would approve of the work Midoriya was planning to do. Would they fight? What would he do if they did meet again? Would he have to fake his personality to him? He wanted to save him. He was doing this for himself, but also for the boy that saved him. Do you think he'd be willing to join us? Shigaraki asked, watching Midoriya from the corner of his eye. The question made Midoriya raise his head a bit with wide eyes. Join them? Turning that beautiful, pure boy into a villain? But they could fight the world together. He could save him and do it honestly. He could show him how he changed him with his words. Maybe he would. You would love to have him. He's got an amazing quirk. He holds a small grudge against heroes too. He's got to be super strong and dash, but would it be that easy? Midoriya paused when he saw Shigaraki lean over the counter with his fingers to his lips, thinking intensely. You'll need help persuading someone like that. He still wants to be a hero, doesn't he? It can't be that easy. It won't be that easy. Someone as pure-hearted as that can't be so willing to join people like them. If you have faith that he can come to us, then let me know if I can get something as a means of persuasion. Like blackmail? Not necessarily. Like if there's something he wants more than anything that he couldn't get by being who he is now. Something that the heroes would never be able to give him. Though I suppose blackmail could work too if dash. I don't want to do that. Midoriya was not going to let Todoroki be blackmailed. But bribed, maybe he would succumb to that, although deep down he hoped he wasn't that shallow. He'd have to learn more about him. He'd have to learn his deepest desires, his most far-off dreams, his most desperate wishes. Someone like Todoroki, that beautiful boy that gave him hope and purpose again, wouldn't be so easily moved by material goods. But the fact that Shigaraki was willing to help him, even if it was for selfish reasons or not, he was grateful. Midoriya soon yawned and rubbed his tired eyes. It wasn't the usual time for him to leave yet, but he still felt so exhausted. He wanted to stay here just a little bit longer. He wanted to spend more time with Shigaraki. He wanted to enjoy Kurojire's company more. He wanted to tell them all about Todoroki. His dreams felt real when he was here with these two villains. He didn't notice himself starting to doze off as his fantasized dreams and actual dreams were beginning to blend together. Going in and out of sleep while sitting up on the stool was something he began to struggle with all of a sudden. Shigaraki felt a weight leaning against his arm only to notice a teenager was fast asleep against him, the controller still in his grip. He couldn't help but freeze up a bit and maybe even mentally panic because now he was stuck. But it was then he felt a strange feeling in his chest and it was terribly painful, although the pain wasn't physical. His own hands began to tremble slightly as when he looked from the corner of his eyes, he only saw black hair in pigtails on the person against him. But when actually turned to look, it was a green fluffy mess of hair instead. He must have been getting tired too, seeing such strange things. You like him, don't you? Kurogiri broke the silence as he reached over to take the controller out of Midoriya's hands and set it on the counter so he wouldn't drop it and wake himself up. Though he was sure to keep his voice quiet to not wake the sleeping boy. Shigaraki only stared at the freckled face that was squished against his arm. This boy was looking so tired lately, studying so hard so that he could be of the utmost use when he was ready to take the next step. He was working so hard. And he was working so hard for him, for this boy he kept telling him about, and for himself. Shigaraki hated so many things, hated so many people. But there was no hatred towards this little sleeping boy. Maybe, he answered at last. Maybe the exact opposite of hatred. Well, I like him, Kurogiri said bluntly. Well, that's a bit odd for you. Last I remember, you hated kids. Shigaraki grumbled with a hint of salt behind his words. It made the dark fogman's eyes narrow but not in anger or spite. A simple expression of thought was all he was portraying. That was a while ago. But I almost pity this one. But with how determined he is, I find myself wanting to watch him grow. I'm curious about what will become of him. Kurogiri turned his back to Shigaraki as he began organizing bottles that were already neatly placed on shelves against the wall. The skinny villain could only scoff at how much of a neat freak he was. I'm also curious about what he can do to this boy he thinks so highly of. The son of Endeavor would be a powerful asset to you. However, his morals and philosophies are but a mystery to us all. Kurogiri continued. By now, Shigaraki was no longer paying any mind to his game, but simply watching Midoriya sleep so soundly against his arm. What was this boy truly capable of? What would happen if something went wrong? Was he willing to leave Midoriya behind? Above all, I look forward to seeing you work with him and his motivations. He looks up to you now. I'm aware that something like this is very new for you. Kurogiri's eyes angled in a way that represented a smirk on his mouthless face. Clearly you trust him, taking your dear father off like so. I admit you've surprised me with that. And now I have to wonder, Shigaraki Tamura, are you getting attached? The man turned around to see Shigaraki had put an arm around Midoriya to keep him up against his side and to prevent him from falling over. He was almost hypnotized by his own actions, simply feeling the need to keep the sleeping boy like this. Comfortable. Trusted. Kurogiri made a short chuckle at the sight he was beholding and merely shrugged it off. Dear friend, what were you thinking with this one? He said softly to himself. When Midoriya woke up just before noon, he found himself in a bed that was not his own, though he was very comfortable. He sat up and rubbed his dark eyes, looking around to figure out where he had been taken to. An empty, undecorated, and slightly dusty bedroom was where he found himself. There was an open door that gave him the view of a type of apartment-like place. Out the window, he could see he was still in the same location as the bar, but higher up. So the second floor was living spaces? You can stay here if you want, you know? Shigaraki's voice came from the corner of the room where a single table was placed. There wasn't even a chair. He was sitting on top of it with no hand blocking his face. You take pretty long walks going from home to here every night. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. Midoriya rubbed his face to attempt to wake himself up more and comprehend what Shigaraki was telling him. He just woke up and now he was being told he could live here. He needed a second to process things. Are you sure that's okay? He groaned. He's supposed to be working for Shigaraki and he felt like he was being spoiled with the laboratory, the time to study, and now a new living space. It'll make you more efficient, wouldn't it? Shigaraki asked back. You get your first corpse tonight. So I need you in the best condition to focus on what you can learn. He got up from the table and went to the doorway and leaned against the frame, folding his arms casually. It's empty right now, but you can have this be your little apartment. I can give you some cash or Kurogiri could snag anything you want for it. So like, he paused and scratched at his neck slightly. Make yourself at home, I guess. Midoriya stared at Shigaraki as the latter avoided eye contact by staring off at a wall and in general emitting an awkward vibe. Despite how creepy and friendly he was in their first meeting, it turns out that his boss was a socially awkward hermit after all. Midoriya almost found it funny, but he didn't want to make fun of him. And the taller young man began to walk out and leave when the freckled villain raised his hand out straight. Wait a second, he called out when the other's back was turned. I forgot. I never got to thank you for saving me from that hero that night. And now you gave me all of this so, with sleepy eyes and a sleepy smile, Midoriya scratched his cheek with one finger awkwardly. Thank you, Tom. Hearing this, Shigaraki lost all color to his skin and his eyes seemed to lose all life as his soul completely left his body. He looked like a standing corpse. That stupid little nickname killed him. It was so stupid. It was cripplingly embarrassing. Why the hell did he feel the need to call him that? He was left completely speechless as all his weight pressed against the door frame. He died. Temporarily. He wanted to be the worst villain in the world and take down the strongest hero, but he was the embodiment of social anxiety. Midoriya watched Shigaraki slowly drag his feet out of the room and silently left like a zombie. The teenager couldn't help but snicker at the fact Shigaraki got so embarrassed that he broke with just a nickname. Bakugo didn't react like that at all when he was given the nickname Kaken. Bakugo was just pissed. He just unintentionally traumatized a murderer. Midoriya found out very quickly that Kurogiri was a god of a cook when he came down to the bar for breakfast/lunch. Whether it was a snack or a full meal, he could make anything taste amazing. Though when he came to eat a full meal, Shigaraki was in his usual seat eating a single bag of chips. He sparked a bit of curiosity within him. Tomu, are you skinny because you don't eat, or is it your quirk? He asked. Shigaraki flinched with death as his soul pieced out for a good few seconds before he regained half of his composure. It made Kurogiri chuckle quietly to himself as this child has learned how to mentally kill this blue-haired young man. Healthy food is gross and my body breaks stuff down really fast. He answered casually only for Midoriya to whip out a notepad from his pocket and rapidly take quick notes. Don't take notes on me. He felt like he was being added to the hit list. But I have to. If something happens to you, I have to know the best way to fix you. So I need to know how you work. Midoriya answered and it made the older villain blush for a moment before looking away and going on his phone. Whatever. His reaction made the teenager giggle to himself. How was he ever scared of this guy in the first place? He was so easy to tease. At least I'm not head over heels for someone I don't even know their name too, he sneered, making Midoriya go bright red instantly. He was so petty. I told you I don't have a crush on him. Midoriya whined. Kurogiri watched the two go back and forth childishly and could only sigh at their foolish teases. Like siblings. Midoriya stood at the side of his working table and was frozen in his place. He held a scalpel in gloved hands, his black hoodie on his favorite desk chair, black flu mask over his mouth and nose. He was supposed to be ready. He trembled as he stared down at the corpse laying on his experimentation table. There was a deep and jagged gash at the center of its face that likely led to a rather painful death. The blade in the little villain's hand was held close to his own chest, too shaken to begin the work he told himself he had been looking forward to. He wasn't even the one that killed this man, and yet his anxiety was going out of control. If it makes you feel better, these things weren't good people when they were alive, Shigaraki said as he sat on Midoriya's desk behind him. His right leg was over the left and he had his arms folded, no hand covering his face. Seeing his complexion was becoming very normal by now. I hate normal people. But I hate some more than others, he said casually. He slowly got up and stretched. I can see you shaking. What are you so scared of? He walked up beside him and bent down a bit to look at this freckled villain at more eye level. He kept his tone calm and almost uncharacteristically soft. He wasn't pressuring him to rush or hounding him for not being ready even though he's been studying nonstop for more than a month. Was he always this patient? I don't know, Midoriya mumbled. He stabbed the hero in the eye, but that was technically an accident. But he started laughing about it. Was it out of hysteria? Was he worried about what that beautiful boy would think of him if he went through with this? What his mother would think? He's been sneaking out so much he hardly saw her anymore. Was he nervous about disappointing Shigaraki and Kurogyari? Was he that afraid of messing up? What was there to mess up? He wasn't the one that killed the corpse in front of him. He hasn't even committed murder yet. But why did he feel so pathetic? His free hand began to lightly scratch at his wrist, but Shigaraki took his wrist and lightly pulled it away. A hypocrite. Don't think about it, he told him, standing up a bit straighter again and leaned back in his place. He was just gazing up at the ceiling looking rather bored, but that was his usual expression. The boy next to him could tell he was just thinking of the right thing to say. Be curious. Give yourself a chance. Then Shigaraki put his hand in the fluffy green mess that was the freckled boy's hair and ruffled it up with a finger raised. He could never be too careful. Midoriya shut his eyes tight from the pressure being pushed down on his head. It wasn't too harsh. It was rather playful actually. But the boy did listen, and when the brotherly assault ended, he pushed his hair out of his face to look at the scalpel in his hand. Give himself a chance. Shigaraki patted his shoulder before walking past him to the other side of the laboratory and lightly kicked a large furnace. Burn it when you're done. You wouldn't like the smell if we just left it here. And we can't just toss them out. They would be very likely to get caught if they just tossed them around the city. And with those last instructions, Shigaraki walked past the little villain one more time, lightly nudging his freckled cheeks with his thumb and index finger on the way, and returning to the elevator to go back up to the central area of Kurogyari's bar. Thus, leaving Midoriya all by himself with a dead body on his table. Midoriya would remain still for at least a few minutes more. The room was completely silent. What was he waiting for? There was no messing up. Be curious. And with a twisted curiosity, he began examining the corpse before doing anything more. It was stone cold, the color was drained from the skin, and there were no broken bones or fractures to be found. He began poking and feeling at it carefully. It was an adult male with faint remnants of fish scales on his neck. Hybrid transformation quirk, a type of scaly defense? He muttered to himself, going to his desk to retrieve a different notebook as he began to sketch the corpse out on paper and take notes beside the drawing. Then he tried stabbing the scales on the neck with a knife only to see that it would not penetrate. So instead he took out a different knife and sliced off a large chunk of flesh from the corpse's bicep with a motion that can only be compared to a butcher carving meat. The teenager held the bloodied piece of skin, muscle, and tissue in his hands and began to lightly peel at the top layer of flesh to find scales hiding underneath. Curious. Curious. He wanted to know so much more. Would scales appear as an instinctive reaction to conflict, or were they summoned voluntarily? How were they summoned? What parts of the body controlled them? What were they made of? How did the body produce them? What would happen if they broke? Many questions he could only be answered if this corpse was alive. So he could only work with what he had. And yet he wouldn't complain. His thirst for knowledge was taking over once again. He was no longer a fanboy gushing over the mysteries and limits of quirks. Now he was dissecting them and taking notes on his own work. This was his own work. His impact would be grounded in his intelligence and knowledge of quirks. There was no fear anymore. There was not a hint of hesitation. Though he was extremely delicate and careful, using a steady hand to poke and slice without a quiver. His eyes seemed to have that ominous glow as they narrowed in complete focus, constantly switching from investigating to note-taking naturally. This is what Shigaraki was letting him become. Shigaraki and Kurogyari did so much for him to finally reach the step of actually being useful. He wanted to make them proud. After many hours of non-stop work, the furnace door was slammed shut after the corpse was moved from the experimenting table to a table on wheels and then slid into the flames to burn up into ash. Once the corpse itself was taken care of, Midoriya responsibly cleaned and sterilized all of his tools. He returned all chemicals to their proper cabinets. He scrubbed the floors of any fluids or remains that may have fallen. It felt so casual now. His energy had skyrocketed from the sheer excitement of taking what he had learned from studying and using it himself and then making his own discoveries. Behind his mask, he had a childish grin filled with pride as he cleaned up his laboratory. Being productive. making an impact. This feeling was amazing. Once all had been tidied up to his satisfaction, Midoriya had cleaned himself off to the best of his ability. His hands were mostly clean thanks to his gloves. But the same could not be said to his hoodie that was excessively stained after hours of sifting through a human body. There wasn't much he could do about it, but it was best not to wear it home for his mother to see. His mother? She has been so silent all this time. She would greet him every late morning, cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. She was fully aware that he had been sneaking out at night and coming back at the break of dawn. And yet she has done nothing because he never returned hurt, suspicious, or with anyone. When he came back, he simply looked tired but not miserable. Surely she could ask. She likely would at some point. Perhaps she's been keeping a distance due to all the intense studying he's been doing at home. How much of a blessing she has been this whole time. It would break her heart if she ever found out what he's been up to, especially now that he's gone this far for Shigaraki. How disappointed she'd be. But Midoriya shook his head furiously at the thought, even slapping the water flowing out of the sink in a small fit. How disappointed she'd be. It wasn't her fault that he didn't have a quirk. He would never blame her. But she, too, had no faith in his ability to be something big, a great and shining hero. But that beautiful boy at the school did. This was for him. This was to save him from his father. This was to bring him closer. To bring him here with Kurogiri and Shigaraki. They'd take good care of that boy here just like they've done for this green-haired mess Shigaraki found on the street in the middle of the night. And to have someone like that here all the time with him? Midoriya found himself blushing and splashed water into his face, scrubbing aggressively hard into his skin. That guy. He looked down at the water pooling in the sink and shifting between dark shades of red and then fading into pink. He never put much thought into it and denied all of Shigaraki's childish teasing, and yet he couldn't help but question a part of himself. He's never really thought of boys to be beautiful before. But he's also never had any friends to think of as beautiful either. The closest thing he had to a friend. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a last chance dive off the roof. That wretched voice echoed in his head, his eyes scrunched tightly. No, Bakugo could not compare to someone like that red and white-haired boy he met. Even if it was just for an hour or two, it was all he needed to make his chest start to feel fuzzy. This was something he's never felt before. His arms holding him at his waist. Saving him. The arm around him to hold him close. Bringing him down safely even though he was hurting too. Empathizing with him even though his pain probably couldn't compare to that of those burns on his arms. And that burn on his face? He must have been through more than he could have told him that day. But the tone of his voice, the cold bitterness with the burning hatred in his eyes and the softness yet the toned shape of his face. The guy. He was so pretty, he mumbled to himself as he then found himself holding his own waist, reminiscing over that feeling of almost falling off the roof. He wanted to be held like that one more time. 2 more times, no, dozens of times. Midoriya's cheeks blushed as he held himself, his knees turning inwards as his head tilted. His eyes had that familiar glow as a terrible smile grew on his freckled face. Splotches of blood littered his clothes and a single strand of spatter remained on the skin next to his lips. I think I really want him, he nearly giggled in the dim light of his laboratory. The elevator doors would eventually open to the main hub of Kurogiri's bar with Midoriya coming through to take a seat in his usual seat next to Shigaraki. Well, someone looks happy, Kurogiri commented as the boy had that same smile plastered on his face and shoved his notebook forward to the dark fog man. It was incredible. I was able to learn more from that than I have all week, he said ecstatically. Letting Kurogiri take the notebook, Midoriya watched him turn quite a few pages to look over the information he had taken from one subject. The freckled villain kicked his feet, leaning forward, and gripping the fabric on his knees with a kind of cute excitement. But he still never got all the blood off his face and hoodie. It was some twisted version of a child showing his dad what he drew in class today. Noticing the few spots of blood on Midoriya's face, Shigaraki was on his phone and eventually licked his thumb to smear away the spots. Couldn't have him going outside looking like that and getting caught. But the action made the boy lean back in protest and turn his face to try and get away without too much effort. Gross, he whined. But Shigaraki poked his forehead instead just enough to almost make him fall off, but didn't of course. "You're gross," he retorted monotoned. "Well, you're gross," Midoriya said right back but couldn't keep a straight face about it and started snickering. Seeing how happy he was now compared to when he was left with a corpse, Shigaraki was able to take a calm deep breath. He's been adjusting so well so far. "These are very impressive," Kurogyari eventually said, handing the notes to Shigaraki to look over. The scrawny villain took them and silently looked over them with a frozen expression. He looked focused, but he was taking this very seriously. Reading each word carefully, looking over each drawing, each label, one could only wonder if he comprehended what was written. There were lots of medical terms only someone like Midoriya would know at this point. Though the killer next to him was childish, he was nowhere near stupid. But anxiety began to well up in the young villain's chest because he couldn't tell what the older one was thinking. He was completely stone-faced. At least until he smirked with a slight scoff and lowered the notebook. "Give me a day to get you the computer stuff to type these out with the drawings. Then you can send it to me," he said, sliding the notebook to the little villain. Was that it? The fact he was willing to set him up with access to a neater setup was an honor, but his face was about to look mildly disappointed when he felt a hand with only 4 fingers on his head and lightly pet him side to side. "You're going to be one of the greatest villains at this rate," he praised Midoriya. Those words made the teenager freeze as his head was lightly being swayed left to right. Shigaraki paid him no mind and let him have his little moment, even ignoring the single tear that escaped his eye. He could just tell that this little villain hasn't had genuine praise in quite a long time. Between emotional manipulation and genuine affection, Midoriya couldn't tell what he was receiving at this very moment. It wasn't like he cared, however. When Shigaraki stopped his petting, he hunched over the counter to go through his phone and settings to find his phone number. Midoriya leaned to the side to get a nosy peek at what he was doing and got the hint as to what he was going for. He took his own phone out and went into his contacts. And though he didn't necessarily have to do this to see, he leaned further to the side to press himself into the older villain's arm and shoulder. Just to be against him and put some weight against him as he entered in the phone number. Shigaraki stayed still and let him press against him without a word. He even watched the little villain enter the contact name. For obvious reasons, he wouldn't put Shigaraki Tamura. What if someone saw? He had a better idea. "Big brother." Seeing this made Shigaraki blink a few times and then look away like he never saw it. Embarrassed? Absolutely. But was he going to say anything against it? Absolutely not. Typing that contact name down made Midoriya's smile soften. This name felt just right. "Could I see your coat, Midoriya?" Kurogyari asked, coming around to the same side of the bar. Without much thought, the teenager did as asked and unzipped his bloody black hoodie and had the man take it. "Let me wash it for you before someone catches you outside." And thus he warped off with it, but not without Shigaraki snatching something from his back pocket. When Kurogyari left, he put in his password that he must have learned at some point and went digging to find his number and set it on the counter. "He had to get a new number, so I need it too," he said casually. That was not a lie as he put the man's number into his own contacts. But he did peer over at the little villain's screen and saw him name the number Dad and had to cover his mouth to keep from laughing. As dawn drew closer, Midoriya was sent on his way to go back to his mother's home. He waved goodbye and went on his way with a sleepy smile. Tonight was a big step into becoming a villain with Shigaraki as his guide. Never had his heart been filled with so much pride and joy. He was becoming something. He was going to prove everyone wrong. And he was going to make the beautiful boy his. "I never took you as the supportive type," Kurogyari commented as he was shining a glass cup. Shigaraki was playing on his phone on his favorite stool and just smirked with a shrug. "Never took you as the fatherly type. You're not so tough anymore in your old age, are you?" He instigated with his smirk growing to a mischievous grin. The taunt made the man in the suit's glowing yellow eyes narrow. The scrawny troublemaker could be such a brat sometimes. But deep down, he knew he had every right to be. "What's that supposed to mean, Shigaraki Tamura?" he challenged as he slowly put the glass down on the counter. He wasn't going to fight this young man. There would be no point and he honestly did not want to. but he was willing to put on a show to remind him that he was not some kind of servant. His dark fog body mass began to expand slightly in a small form of intimidation. He put you as Dad on his phone. Shigaraki lightly snickered. What? Kurogiri's body immediately compressed into its normal size and his eyes slightly expanded. His phone? Yes? I gave him your number. I understand. Your contact name is Dad's. And thus the dark fog Dad's foggy head went from being a compressed cloud of matter into a misty mess as it expanded unevenly and thinly as a reaction of embarrassment but also something else. Ha! Shigaraki said and pointed at him as a tease. Izuku. Midoriya's dearest mother cried out from across the house. It wasn't noon yet, but with Midoriya going to bed between 6 and 7 in the morning was too early to wake up. But his mother's cries were enough to make him groan. She wasn't sobbing, just probably in a normal panic. He rolled over in bed and covered his head with his favorite white hoodie that was a bit too big for him. He always slept with it. It was difficult to sleep without it by now. Izuku, wake up! Inko cried out, having come into his room and began frantically shaking him. Yue sent you a letter. Your entrance exam is this week. How hopeless she was, still believing that he had dreams for that school. Perhaps he did, but not with the same intentions as before. He couldn't help but feel overwhelming anger at the sound of her tearful excitement, but quickly remembered that this was his mother. She meant no harm. And yet when he hid his face in the hoodie, he immediately remembered. He'll be there. Surely he'll be there. Midoriya sat up and took the letter from his mother's hands as she clung to his shoulders and tried to read it with him. The anticipation was going to give her a heart attack. Her eyes were too full of tears to read it. It's a reminder that the entrance exam is this week? I completely forgot, he mumbled, still sounding beyond exhausted. It wasn't like he dissected a whole human body last night. But he fought the tiredness to read on further. Because I'm quirkless, they're giving me a special test. All but. He gritted his teeth and his grip on the paper tightened. He was still bitter against this society. I won't be able to apply to the hero course. But there are others to choose from. So I won't be taking the hero exam. Not fair. Not fair at all. Even if the school just started allowing quirkless people in, they still ban them from even trying to be heroes. He'll show them. Oh, that sounds wonderful, sweetie. Inko smiled as she wiped her eyes. Had anyone else said that, Midoriya would be more than just furious. But he knew his mother was just scared that he was going to get hurt and was just happy that this school was giving her son some kind of a chance. She meant well. If only she knew. So what are they offering? What's on there? She leaned in a bit to try and get a closer look. Business, investigation, costume support, costume equipment, mass media, agency bill dash. Medical. Midoriya cut her off, staring at another faction of the school. His eyes were locked on the medical support course. I want to do medicine, he repeated. How much more he could learn. How much more he could impress Shigaraki and Kurogiri. The school would be teaching him how to more properly rip people apart. The irony was almost enough to make him burst out laughing. But he had to control himself. Bite his tongue. Play nice with the other kids. That control started at home. He forced a sweet, innocent smile to his mother that looked as natural as could be, almost as if his face was glittering with joy. I want to be a doctor. The pure smile of her dearest son was enough to make Inko tear up again and hug on to him tightly. She was beginning to believe that he finally let go of the hero dream to pursue something just as admirable. His hopes didn't have to be crushed by reality any longer. At least, that's what she was being led to believe. My baby's going to be a doctor. That sounds wonderful, Izuku. I'm so happy, she said so lovingly as Izuku used on hand to keep her embrace close. Yeah. I'm going to save so many people, he said dreamily with his eyes peacefully closed. Going to save him. Over the next couple of days, Midoriya would start leaving just before sundown to go out instead of sneaking out late at night. Without a subject to practice on and to give himself a break from all-day studying, he would go out shopping instead. But only kind of. He would casually take pictures of things in department and furniture stores around the city that he liked and send them to Kurogiri. He would also wander into a few electronic stores and take pictures of things to send them to Shigaraki. When school started once again, he imagined that he wouldn't be returning to his mother too often. It would be much more convenient to start living in his new home, with his new family. Now he got to choose anything he wanted without a budget. How easy it was to steal with a teleportation quirk. Midoriya had also found out one night that Shigaraki was incredibly tech-savvy. He watched him one night, with just a laptop at the bar with tons of wires attached to it. He was able to hack into any store the little villain had gone into and temporarily turn off security cameras. Long enough to let Kurogiri steal things from inventory rooms, but short enough to make it look like a glitch or malfunction. It impressed the boy and made him look up to Shigaraki even more. Of course, the latter let it fill his ego just a little bit more. By the end of the week, Midoriya was able to decorate his apartment space in any way he wanted. No longer was his room forced to remain tainted with All Might merchandise. Instead, the walls were clean and more mature. His color preference had changed as much of his furniture was black and decorations were kept monochrome colors except for the occasional dash of red. On the night before the exam, much of his personal things had been moved in too. Clothes filled the drawers. Books filled his shelves. His bathroom was set for his own needs. This was going to be home very soon. Shigaraki would find Midoriya sitting on his bed and holding the special white hoodie close to himself. He's even brought something as important as that with him. As of that moment, he appeared to be daydreaming while staring out the window at the twinkling city lights outside. With the lights off, they made the room more colorful and provided the perfect atmosphere to stop thinking for once. To keep from rudely disturbing him, Shigaraki sat down at the foot of the bed and would stay there silently for at least a few minutes. He would look around at the newly decorated space and just enjoy a silent moment with the younger villain, letting him have a moment to think to himself. "Do you really think he'll be there?" Midoriya asked quietly. He had acknowledged the other presence in the room by now but did not make eye contact with him, too focused on the lights coming from outside. "Yeah, it would make sense," the other responded with a shrug. Was it something he was really worried about? This guy he only met for a fraction of a day seemed to be on his mind quite often. He teased him about having a crush on him dozens of times by now, but was the denial out of embarrassment or confusion? "Tomo," Midoriya began to say something but paused as he hugged the white hoodie closer to his nose. The sound of that terrible nickname made the killer at the foot of the bed blush and show a grumpy expression. How degrading. Some big bad villain he was for letting this teenager call him something as demeaning as that. "If I did like him, would that be okay?" "What do you mean? You talk about him all the time so clearly, you don't hate him." "No, not like that." The question made Shigaraki think for a moment. Was Midoriya admitting to having a crush on this mysterious boy after all? Or was he trying to figure that part out still? Something that he had to keep in mind was that this little villain was still growing up. Still learning about the world, but also himself. Still figuring things out. "So you're asking me that if you actually did have a crush on him, would I allow it?" Shigaraki tried to clarify. Allow it as a leader for his underling to have romantic feelings? Or allow him to have romantic feelings for a boy, period? I'm just confused. I've never really had friends or anything like that. So I don't know what I'm feeling. Feelings. Such terribly confusing things. I don't know if it's a crush, or looking forward to having a real friend. I get so nervous when I think about seeing him again. But maybe it's just because I tried to do something stupid the first second he met me. He probably thinks I'm so weird. Maybe he'll never want to talk to me again. Or maybe he's changed over the summer. What if he's not the same person? What if his father got to him and completely changed his personality? What if I'm just getting my hopes up just to be destroyed? Midoriya would find himself amid an anxious ramble, not noticing that he had begun to scratch at his wrists subconsciously. It wasn't until Shigaraki grabbed his wrist with a pinky up and pulled it away. "What are you really worried about, Izuku?" Midoriya froze when he felt his wrist be pulled away and suddenly realized the subtle burning sensation from his nails digging into his skin. He had picked up such horrible habits. Shigaraki's hand easily gripped his wrist firmly from how skinny he was. His anxiety was branching into self-harming habits just like the one he looked up to. But he would never blame the one as he saw as a big brother for it. Right now, That person was trying to understand what was giving him all this anxiety. What was he truly scared of? If these are romantic feelings for another boy, are you going to be angry? Would Shigaraki approve of such a relationship? It would seem odd, but not odd for a villain such as him, filled with hatred and bitterness, to disapprove of things like that. But even as a villain, a killer, maybe a monster, he was not without heart. Here he was at that moment, keeping his new little brother from falling too deep into self-harm. I don't really get that stuff. If you're asking me if I'm going to kill you for liking some guy, the answer is no. I'm not like that. That stuff is already. He paused for a second and his face nearly cringed thinking about it. It's so gross. He had the mentality of a child. Anything romantic was just disgusting to him. People's lips touching, how revolting. The answer was enough to make Midoriya get a tiny bit emotional as he bit his lower lip and, with the hoodie still in his grasp, hugged Shigaraki's skinny torso. The reaction made the older villain lose all color once again as his soul yeeted out of existence for a short time frame. The little teenager smiled as he hugged on tight to the limp body of his makeshift big brother. "Thanks, Tomu, for everything," he said sappily. "Kill me," was all the other could wheeze out. This kid was going to be the death of him. He just wanted to rip his ears out, gouge out his eyes, bash his head into a wall. A letter had come in through the mail with video to watch with it from Yue. Watching and listening to all might congratulate him on the written tests he aced was a whole new form of torture. It was sickening to receive praise from someone like him. A man full of lies could only tell lies. How dare he stand in front of that camera with that plastered smile and even try to support him? Midoriya had the coldest glare as he watched the video play, letting his hand go to his wrist and subconsciously scratched at it. All the lies he was spreading to all these students who passed their tests. Was that beautiful boy watching something like this too? When Midoriya walked out of his room to find Inko waiting right outside the door with her hands clasped together at her chest. Her eyes were just shimmering with worry but hopefulness for him. She desperately wanted to know what the letter said. And thus her son put on a fake, but very believable, soft smile of assurance. That smile alone sent his mother into dramatic tears of joy as she clung to him in a hug full of pride and happiness. Midoriya faked that smile through the hug and continued afterwards to let her be happy in bliss. That smile would change to a focused gaze that was void of all that false joy and childish excitement. He was no longer having a lovely home-cooked dinner with his beloved mother with the TV on in the background. Now there was the sound of a bone snapping as he was in his laboratory, clothes stained with blood spatter, face spotted in red amongst his freckles, and his eyes darkened with intense focus and precision. For right now, he wanted to test how far in which directions it would take to dislocate bones in a body, although the body on his table had been sliced and sewn up again in many places. It wasn't like he could get a fresh body every day. He needed to make them last at least a few nights. "So when's your first day?" Shigaraki asked from sitting on top of a workbench behind Midoriya. He was just observing him with his arms folded, curious how this little schoolboy worked and seeing how much he had changed since their first encounter. He looked so comfortable in his skin now. After this weekend, he answered in a monotone voice. 2 more free days was all he had before becoming a full-time student once again. "What class are you in?" "General course of Class 1C. "What happened to the medical course?" "Not enough people passed. It was supposed to be their hardest test aside from the hero course." "Are you still in the program?" "I'll be training with medical professionals while everyone else does quirk training." Midoriya dislocated another bone with an angle measure next to it and proceeded to take more notes while answering Shigaraki's slew of questions. It did not feel like an interrogation, just mild curiosity which he didn't mind. If anything, Shigaraki could pick up the hint that his little brother was very angry, although he didn't show it with blunt rage. It came out in how intensely serious he was treating the corpse on his table. He could tell that he was anticipating feeling lonely and left out at school all over again. Being the only kid without a quirk and being excluded from specific activities. His jealousy of people with quirks was reaching new levels and made him hate them even more. Shigaraki sat on the desk tabletop in silence for a while longer, listening to bones snapping for quite a long time. He would just casually play on his phone and kick his feet a few times, peek at some notes that were around him, and just generally leave Midoriya to his work. Think you could kill someone before you begin? He would suddenly ask after at least an hour of silence. The question made Midoriya casually freeze in his note-taking as he thought it over. The bodies on his table had all been killed for him and delivered here to make for easy examinations and testing. To kill his own subject would be the last step to being a fully fledged villain doctor. The blood would truly be on his hands. There would be no going back to living the life of a normal schoolboy, even though what he was doing already was nowhere near normal. Was he ready to take a life for himself? You said my subjects weren't exactly good people, right? Midoriya asked. I don't know if I'm ready to kill someone who doesn't deserve to die. No one was perfect, but some people were worse than others. He wasn't ready to take the life of some random person who's only made a few hurtful mistakes, though Shigaraki probably didn't care about that anymore. And of course, heroes didn't count because they were going out of their way to show off their quirks and make society weaker and more dependent. But Shigaraki has also been the kind of person to respect Midoriya's requests and morals. Shigaraki got off the desk and walked over to his little brother and pulled up a chair to sit beside him. But he did not sit normally, he chose to sit on it with the back of it against his chest. With his chin on the top of the backing, he tilted his head slightly to be more comfortable. We can start with that. That's what you've been starting with, he offered as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through a few things before showing the screen. It was a news article with the subject's mugshot on it. The corpse was an escaped criminal and the article listed all his crimes that included things that made Midoriya's blood boil. I wouldn't trick you with stuff like this. Shigaraki wanted to make that clear. I'll get you a pretty bad guy before your last free day. When you start doing this yourself, you can ask questions to avoid making guesses about quirk functions, and you could probably do psychological testing at some point. It'll be a good starting point to get you into combat too. Combat? You'll let me do combat? Midoriya had stopped his work by now as all his focus was on his big brother. His back was to the subject as he looked to Shigaraki with curious and hopeful eyes. Once again, he was given the chance to prove himself on something everyone doubted him in. Even without genetic power, surely he could still be of use somehow. I'll have to find you a teacher, probably. But you want a part in that little hit list you made, right? Shigaraki had likely been thinking about this for quite some time. There was no way that Midoriya would be satisfied with just being a doctor. You could teach me, couldn't you? The older villain looked at his hand when he was asked. It wouldn't be safe. And he wasn't even the type to use weapons because they would just turn to dust if he tried having a firm grasp on them. But Midoriya would love it if his big brother was his teacher. Maybe with defense. You'll need someone else for offense? Instead of leaving him out, he was willing to accommodate his needs. It made the little villain's heart flutter as he smiled softly to himself. The idea of killing and learning how to kill was filling him with anticipation. Shigaraki had returned to the bar for that night to let Midoriya continue his work in peace until the little villain felt he had done enough. He took the elevator to the floor with his room and quickly got changed and washed up before going to the bar to join Shigaraki and Kurogiri. As it was becoming tradition, Kurogiri took the little villain's stained clothes and would wash them for him. The dark fog dad figure would meanwhile fix a snack for him to make sure he was at least getting baseline nutrition. Midoriya rested his head on his arms that were on the counter as he munched on some food, watching Shigaraki scroll through his phone. The little villain looked exhausted from working all night, and his mother kept him up in the daytime to gush over his success of getting into UA. The circles and bags around his eyes have gotten a bit more intense this past week, and now his body was physically acting on the exhaustion. And Shigaraki took notice with just a glance at him. Take the day off tomorrow, he casually demanded out of nowhere, not looking away from his phone now. The sound of that command made the tired boy twitch and gazed up at him from his arms. What? No, it's dashed. He started to subtly panic. He wasn't being lazy or disloyal or giving up. Shigaraki didn't think he was any of those things, right? Was he pitying him? Or was this a test? Toma wouldn't do this. He's not like that. You're starting to exhaust yourself. You're not as accurate or productive if you're like that. It's basic stats. Your stamina is way low. The older villain didn't look away from his phone and tapped the side of his own head with one finger. You're smart. How do you replenish stamina? A potion, Midoriya said sarcastically, which earned a hand, minus a pinky finger, to his head that was smothering his face into the counter. But it was not painful. Just a bit of brotherly tough love. No, idiot, Shigaraki grumbled as Midoriya pathetically whined about being squished into the wood counter. Ow, ow, fine. The whines made the scrawny villain weaken his push and let the little villain raise his head again. Coffee. And that comment ended up with his face being smothered once again. Sleep. Shigaraki corrected. Midoriya grumbled after Shigaraki released him from his counter smothering but kept his head in his arms. His eyes were closed, but he would keep himself from falling asleep at the bar again. He had his own room here now, so the least he could do was keep himself awake long enough to drag himself there. However, for now, he just wanted to spend just a little more time with his big brother. Spend more time with him? Tomu, if I take the day off tomorrow, can you take it off with me? Maybe go out? He asked, averting his eyes towards the bottles against the wall with his face tinted a light shade of pink. He was embarrassed to ask, but he wanted to spend more time with this murderous villain. Go out and do something that wasn't work-related for once. And it looked like that villain was ignoring him as he never took his eyes off his phone and stayed quiet for about a minute. Shigaraki had to think it over. I haven't stepped foot outside for leisure since that night I picked you up, he admitted. His hermit status, severe. Of course, he hadn't been outside. Why would he have to if Kurogiri could just pick anything up that he asked for? And Kurogiri appeared to obey his every command, so there was no reason for him to go outside. Shigaraki couldn't promise Midoriya that he would be very fun to be around outside amongst the public. He rested his chin on his palm and subtly sunk his mouth into it, turning away to avoid eye contact. I don't think it'll be all that fun if I go with you, he said honestly, secretly biting at the skin on his lips. Sure, this little villain was clingy to him, which he didn't mind mostly, but he should not be getting his hopes up. But this little villain was stubborn. We can go to an arcade or something. You can show off. Midoriya tried to coax him into it with one of his hobbies. But he was still hesitant. It's not really my thing, Izuku. Just drop. I dashed. The freckled villain reached over to grab the top of Shigaraki's closest hand, careful not to touch his fingers. Please? No one would believe that a simple please was all it took for Shigaraki to cave into Midoriya's wishes. And that very next day, after a long night's rest, the two were out together among the people of the outside world. Though they both shared a similar fashion sense of wearing a lot of black. Shigaraki wore just a black hoodie, but Midoriya would wear a red flannel, unbuttoned to show just a black t-shirt. It was his first day away from the books and the experimentation table since his journey began. The exhaustion was visible around his eyes, but now that he was able to sleep into his desired time without the pressure to work, he seemed much more awake and aware. His walking pace was confident yet casual as Shigaraki dragged his feet slightly just because he dreaded being outside and human interaction. His lack of social ability was exemplified when it was Midoriya that had to go to a cafe cashier and order a coffee and a sugary concoction because he didn't want to talk to anyone, but he did give his little brother the money to pay. I never thought you'd have a sweet tooth, Midoriya commented as Shigaraki drank something filled with chocolate, coffee, candies, and cookie bits. It made him snicker seeing this murderer have such childish traits. Try not to turn into a coffee addict, Shigaraki said back as he poked the side of his little brother's head with mild force. Their casual day together sent them walking around the city and poking into a few arcades. In the afternoon, they passed an alley where a mangled man was passed out against the wall. Purple burns scattered his body and his face. A glass bottle sat in a limp hand, his white belt unbuckled, and the faint aroma of smoke surrounded him. But he was blissfully ignored by the villainous duo. And yet the two also passed a blonde girl with the brightest smile, skipping with shopping bags in each hand, going about her merry way without a care in her mind. Later they would also pass a lizard man with a very tall friend who appeared masculine yet feminine at the same time. It appears they were looking at women's clothes, however, so the lizard man's friend was, respectively, a woman. The brothers would also pass a man in a long cold season coat, a top hat, a scarf, and sunglasses, twirling 2 marbles in his fingers. They were faces all lost in the crowd by the end of the day. Nothing more than a passing stranger, passing nobodies. By the tail end of the evening, Shigaraki and Midoriya shared a small box of fried food while they strolled the city streets, continuing their way home. Just as Midoriya was about to eat a piece, Shigaraki snatched it away with chopsticks that he held incredibly awkwardly, to eat it himself, smirking evilly. To which Midoriya half glared but also returned the grin by stealing the whole box. This playful game of stealing was interrupted, however. "Did you get back? I'm gonna split." "Shut up." They both were faintly able to hear a man crying out from the depths of an alley. Midoriya knew this area well. And the two looked at each other, exchanging looks of annoyance and curiosity. "Criminal. I've seen you on the news," another voice called out, echoing off the walls. Shigaraki sighed and rolled his eyes as he felt Midoriya grab his wrist and pulled him along. Even his big brother wouldn't resist the possibility of a new member of his little group. A new villain to recruit? A criminal? What was his quirk? Could he see what was inside of him too? The little villain had to know. Following the voices and the sounds of conflict, the makeshift brothers would come across two heroes in flashy costumes holding a man against the wall who looked to be in the middle of an anxiety attack. He was sweating profusely and appeared to be in great pain, the stitches at the center of his forehead looked strained and irritated. But the heroes showed no mercy as they ground his head into the brick wall and attempted to restrain him. He was pathetically helpless. It didn't appear that a crime was even committed. There was just a single cigarette on the ground that was still burning faintly. This grown man was in tears and these two heroes were ignoring his cries of pain. "Stop it! Stop it! I'll rip apart." Shigaraki reached into his pocket to retrieve the severed hand that he called father. He placed it over his face before pushing Midoriya behind him lightly to make sure he was a safe distance away from the conflict. "Don't you think you're being a bit rough on him?" he said just loud enough to get the hero's attention. Even the crying man hushed his voice slightly to acknowledge this new presence. "Always ignoring people. You'll walk away from this without a second thought, won't you?" Shigaraki egged on a bit, yet he sounded frustrated. "Are you with this guy?" One hero in a purple mask asked the criminal in his custody. "I just want T to stay, son," the criminal sobbed out. So apathetic, but he was in a panic. Something was mentally wrong with him. And here he was being ignored so cruelly. The second hero in an orange mask began to take a few steps closer to Shigaraki and Midoriya, to which Shigaraki pushed his little brother back a bit more. "I don't like the look of you. Why do you have a kid with you?" he interrogated with his hand twitching a bit. When he was just inches from the decaying villain, the nails on his fingers grew at least a meter long and turned pitch black. "Are we going to have a problem with you?" he snarled, but the villain did not react and just kept a stable glare. His lack of fear must have angered the hero because it earned him a hand to his throat, preparing to choke him. To dash, Midoriya went to reach out for his big brother when a hand with only 4 fingers grasped the hero's wrist. Knowing how the older villain's quirk worked, the teenager kept quiet and watched this play out instead. "How stuck up," Shigaraki grumbled before placing his 5th finger down on the hero's wrist. Within just an instant, the hero's hand was completely severed and soon turned to ash as blood rushed out of the wound. In a panic, the orange-masked man cried out and tried to slash Shigaraki with his other clawed hand only for the villain to disappear from his sight with pure speed, though the claws cut right through the solid brick wall behind him. Before the hero could look for where the villain had gone, there was already a hand on his throat from behind which quickly severed his head and left the corpse's bleeding neck behind. The corpse fell to the dirt ground without resistance as Shigaraki then turned to the purple-masked hero restraining the stranger. That hero was nearly paralyzed by how quickly his ally was murdered by this scrawny villain. But he gritted his teeth and pulled the stranger back just to slam him back into the wall. No, he was not about to flee from this villain. He could fight him. Heroes always win, right? Why is it when you get violent it's fine? But when I try to defend myself, Shigaraki began to grumble. That was no self-defense, you freak. There was no philosophical talk to be had here. The hero in the purple mask raised his hands forward to shoot large lumps of purple sludge at Shigaraki, to which he easily avoided with speed alone. The blobs landed on the ground and brick walls, festering and bubbling, burning away at the area around them slowly. Midoriya wanted to cry out to warn his beloved big brother of the dangers of the quirk. But before he could even make a sound, Shigaraki seemingly disappeared. The hero looked around in a panic, firing sludge at trash cans he may be hiding behind. But there was no one to be found. He couldn't have fled and left this defenseless child behind. Just as the hero was about to look up, Shigaraki dropped down from pipes he was dangling on by his feet and reached to place just one hand on the hero's face. By the time his feet were on the ground, there was nothing but ash and blood in front of him. He scratched the side of his head with a sigh and stretched his neck from side to side a bit. Midoriya could only stand in his place as he watched what his big brother had done. And he was amazed. His eyes sparkled with fascination and awe, looking at him like he used to look at All Might. Except for the guy in front of him, it was not a lie. There was no exaggerated muscle, no flashy costume, no news media filling his ego with compliments. He may be spotted with blood spatter, but he looked like someone that he wanted to be just like. Ow, 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 oh, ow. Keep me together. I'll come apart. The stranger cried as he curled on his knees, gripping his head so tightly. Shigaraki tilted his head at the sight beside him and looked confused as to what his problem was. "The hell is up with you?" he asked. But it didn't look like this guy was even listening to him. Even Midoriya was baffled by this man's words and actions but was at least able to notice how his eyes were shut tight and he was trying to keep his head contained as if it was about to split. So in a moment of quick thinking, he noticed a dirty brown grocery bag on the ground near him. Poking 2 holes in it with his thumb, he walked over and brought it down over the stranger's head. Shigaraki raised a brow to this action but just let his little brother be smart. The stranger tugged the bag down tightly over his head as he dramatically cried and his quivering calmed. His voice became much quieter as his anxiety began to pass. Looking at the 2 villains before him, he did not feel fear. "Thanks," he said much more calmly. "You were so cool. You took those guys out like nothing," he then said again but with a much different tone, and maybe even a different personality. The sudden enthusiasm caught them both off guard as they backed off a bit simultaneously. Too much personality for them. Who are you? They called you a criminal." Shigaraki had no desire for small talk as he tried to question this man who was now wearing a paper bag as a mask. "I shouldn't tell people that. It's dangerous," he said, rubbing his neck but then twitching and putting his fists to his sides proudly. "I'm Twice. Bye-bye Gawara Jean. The clone criminal. Have you heard of me?" 2 personalities, a more level-headed one and one that was not very smart. "But I don't clone myself anymore. I just want to lay low now but it's hard." The 2 brothers listened to this man with 2 personalities. Midoriya looked to Shigaraki to see what he would do about this. Would he offer him to join? Bring this man in as he did for him? "Yeah, life's hard like that," Shigaraki said quietly, reaching into a pocket inside his hoodie. "If the laying low thing doesn't work out for you, try getting a hold of this guy." He handed Twice a card with just a phone number written. Was that a good idea? He just killed 2 people and he was giving out someone he's close to's number to a stranger. Midoriya just watched the older man take the card and look at it angrily, grumbling to himself as he turned it every which way suspiciously. But then he was just beaming. "Booty call, right?" Twice blurted out. Shigaraki just glared and used every ounce of self-control not to kill the guy in front of him. "You're very annoying." "What was that about?" Midoriya asked as the 2 had long begun walking back to Kurogiri's bar, though they had to take back roads. Because of the blood being very visible on Shigaraki's clothes. "Once he told me his name, I kinda knew who he was. He's pretty infamous. He would make clones of himself and do some pretty crazy stuff. But he disappeared for a while recently," he explained. "I guess he went a bit crazy. Having multiple personalities was something the media never reported. Something must have happened if he didn't want to clone himself anymore. But that doesn't mean he was completely useless to him. I've got a guy, he's kinda an info broker/business guy. If I need anything from the black market or to get in contact with someone specifically, he's there. You'll probably see him around eventually." Shigaraki did have operations under works at the moment. He was building connections and using the ones he had very skillfully. Midoriya's eyes sparkled slightly as he peeked up at him from the corner of his eye. His face wasn't all that pretty, he didn't fake a smile, he wasn't physically strong, but he was clever. He was his big brother now. And knowing that made Midoriya feel all fuzzy inside as his face blushed slightly. How lucky he was to have someone like him in his life. He wanted to make him proud tomorrow. That very next afternoon, Midoriya would be standing in his laboratory in front of one of the cages that were kept against the walls. Up until now, they had always been empty. But in one sat a man in tattered clothes, shaggy hair, and had a horrendous odor. His hands were confined in a metal box to render whatever quirk he had useless. It didn't stop him from staring straight at the young villain with deranged eyes and occasionally giggling to himself. Heroes prefer flashy villains to fight to get them more screen time. They leave weirdos like this to roam like rats? Shigaraki said, sitting on the desk which had become his usual sitting place. The crazed man had the biggest smile with his tongue hanging out, giving even Midoriya chills because he was looking directly at him. "Why does he keep looking at me like that?" he asked, holding a knife close to himself but pointed at the cage. This weirdo's presence was making his skin crawl. "I don't think you want to know what this guy's done," Shigaraki said quietly, almost like even he didn't even want to talk about it. "I want to know." Shigaraki pulled out his phone and went scrolling a bit before showing Midoriya the screen which had some pictures of boys his age and some a little older that were heroes in compromising pictures together. But they were not inappropriate enough to keep the media from spreading them. His quirk is getting things he's touched to stick together. He's infamous for ruining heroes' careers as an anonymous photographer. There had to be more than that. Shigaraki wouldn't be killing a guy who was a pain for heroes. And Midoriya knew this and narrowed his eyes. "It's the stuff that's on the dark net that you don't want to know about." The older villain took his phone back and went scrolling again and handed it to the other. It was a series of pictures taken on the phone of a computer screen in a very dark room. It was likely Shigaraki's computer in his room. The images were low quality, but what he saw on the screen made the little villain's stomach churn in every wrong way. He didn't want to know anymore. He didn't want to see things like that with people his age and younger. But he knew now why Shigaraki picked this kind of person. There was no one worse than someone like this. This disgusting, perverted, hideous monster. He gripped the knife in his hands tighter than before and gritted his teeth. "I got some reports of stalking. But with the lack of proof, the cops never took action on it." Shigaraki wasn't done yet. What else was there to know? This creature deserved to die. This creature deserved the most painful death. But before he could go through with it, the scrawny villain showed him a very expensive camera with lots of pictures stored on it still. There were lots of teenagers his age, all boys, but none of them were the settings of the children from the computer. These looked to be potential targets for torturous humiliation he witnessed. But they were not yet harmed. Most were hero students, and he could tell from the costumes that their schools likely provided them. But some were middle school age in those all-black uniforms. Amongst the many faces, he recognized one that beheld bright red eyes and a face of permanent anger. Kaken? Why was he on here? But his curiosity stopped there as he kept scrolling and found another familiar face. One that he could never forget. One with the softest bicolored eyes and hair. One with the most hurtful scar. One with the most beautiful face. Midoriya dropped the camera. He stomped on it. He heard it shatter. His face was hidden in the shadow of his fluffy hair. There was no expression to be seen. It didn't need to be seen. He walked past his work table and swiped the ring of keys that sat at the end of it. Each one was labeled with a letter that corresponded with the letters engraved on the cages. As he got closer, the creature inside the cage appeared to become more excited by his attention and presence. It began laughing and making noises of anticipation when he was just inches away. With zero hesitation, the tongue hanging out of its mouth would be cut off with one movement. The laboratory echoed with screams and chokes of agony. Blood began to flow quickly out of its mouth as it tried to feel desperately for the severed body part. It began to cry as it looked up at Midoriya, eyes begging for mercy from this child. But it only made eye contact with one demonic red hue peeking out from under his hair. It tried to crawl to the far end of the cage when the door was unlocked and opened. Not being physically strong enough to drag the monster out, Midoriya went ahead and crawled in on his hands and knees. He sat tall on his knees, holding his knife above his head, glaring down with a small yet illuminating red glow from one eye. Go. Jigo, there was no tongue to make the sound of an N. Sao dash, it sobbed before the blade came down once into its chest. Then out. Then in its shoulder. Then out. Then in its chest again. Then out. Then in. Out and in repeatedly over and over. The sound only being comparable to carving raw meat. Shigaraki watched Midoriya mutilate the creature in the cage with just one knife. He watched him mutilate a corpse beyond recognition. There was no patience or mercy to even use the body for experimentation. A pool of crimson flooded the tiny cage and dripped through the bars to the laboratory floor. The metal bars had all become splattered and spotted. But Midoriya was drenched. His black hoodie was beyond ruined. Kurogiri would not be able to wash it. It was all over his face, dripping off his cheek. His hair was wet with it all. He soon carefully crawled out of the cage and dropped the knife on the floor, letting it clang a few times. He'd get it later. He'd clean it all later. But in the meantime he just staggered towards the elevator, wanting nothing more than to go to bed. Tired. So tired. He had his first day of school tomorrow. He had to be ready for tomorrow. However, he didn't quite make it before his legs nearly gave out on him all of a sudden. He had felt so powerful just moments ago but then quickly changed to feeling weak. He felt sick, exhausted, and disgusted. It was Shigaraki who caught him before he fell, and instead of making the new killer walk, he put him on his back and held him up from under his knees. Of course, he didn't mind all of the blood or even the smell. He only glanced at his little brother's face from the corner of his eye and only saw the faintest smile. Behind his glowing green eyes, there was a hint of satisfaction and pride. "Are you proud?" Midoriya asked softly, getting a slight grip on his shoulder. "I am." In returning the teenager to his apartment space, he was laid down in his bed without bathing or even changing clothes. The stains would be dealt with later. The corpse would be burned away later. These things could wait until later. For now, this villain needed rest to be prepared for school the next day. Dawn of the next morning began with running water from the showerhead with blood and soap mixing before being sucked down a drain. Midoriya soothingly took a shower in silence with his eyes closed, letting the red wash away and off his freckled skin. In this moment of privacy and peace, he could only anticipate what UA would have in store for him. But all he wanted to know was if he would see that beautiful boy again. He's waited months to see him again. The excitement was morphing with the anxiety of the unknown. Would he be the same? If they were to meet, what would they say to each other? He couldn't help but clutch his chest as it started to subtly hurt. "Please, let this be okay," he said quietly to himself. Midoriya made his way down to the hub of the bar in his brand new school uniform, a boring shade of gray jacket and a red tie, poorly tied in a cute yet incorrect knot. "You can't possibly be going to school like that," Kurogiri said the moment he saw him come down the stairs. Not wasting a moment, he teleported across the room to the teenager and undid whatever horrific knot he made only to redo it properly. "When you come back this afternoon, I'll teach you how to do it right," he said, making the new and proper knot snug at the boy's neck. It made him smile as he loosened it just a bit to make it more comfortable. Shigaraki played on his phone and ate a very unhealthy pack of pastries while his little brother relished in a more nutritious and home-cooked meal for his breakfast. There were no instructions for today. Just get through the first day and settle into the facade of being a giddy first year, eager to help the heroes. He wasn't about to add more pressure yet. Instead, he would trust the little villain to make the proper choices for now. And thus that little villain went to the door with his yellow backpack over his shoulders and looked back at the two at the bar counter. He waved goodbye for Shigaraki to raise his hand for a moment and for Kurogiri to nod his head. Midoriya would sneak back to Inko's house to pretend that he woke up in his room and got dressed and ready before she had woken up. He was sent off the second time with tears and a series of "I love you"s that he was not against receiving. The gaze he had was that of faked bliss and joy as he watched his mother ramble on and on about how proud she was and how much she believed in him with his hands clasped in hers. But all he could see was his hands covered in blood and it getting all over her. In reality, there was nothing there. He couldn't help but keep from seeing it. There was blood on his hands now as a true villain. The smile was key as he just smiled his way through his mother's innocent tears, smiled his way to the train, to the campus front gate. He looked up at the massive entrance and took a deep breath before walking through with a bunch of to-be heroes. Walking towards the main entrance of the building, he had to look around at every hallway and corner. Mapping for later, but for now, where was he? Was he here? He had to be here. He just had to be somewhere. He had to be at this very school. He's been thinking and waiting for him all this time. Though it wasn't the red and white hair he was searching for, from down the hall he was able to get a glimpse of an angrily walking blonde, stomping to class. The falsified smile of awe broke immediately when he saw him. The mask of emotion shattered on his face for a moment as his chest welled up with hatred and bitterness. Dive off the roof? No, he didn't dive off the roof. He didn't kill himself that day. The look of anger on his face began to shift as he reminded himself that he needed to look happy. Thus what came upon his expression was a chaotic smirk and eyes burning with the lust to kill him now. He lightly clutched both his cheeks like he was trying to force his appearance to change. One day you'll beg me to kill you, he said near silently to himself. You're in my way, a raspy voice growled as Midoriya felt a hand grab onto his hair and painfully shoved him aside. He shut his eyes tight and gritted teeth from the pain of getting his hair pulled in such a way. He was only able to get a peek at this new addition to his hit list notebook. It was a student he did not recognize, but he had yellow eyes but black spiky hair like Bakugo. The student was on his way to the Class 1A room. Someone like that didn't deserve to be a hero. Someone like that had to die before he could get that far. Being shoved aside, Midoriya was forced into someone a bit taller than him but didn't make them stumble. If anything, they were just pushed a bit against the wall but put their hands on his shoulders to cushion his motion. He had to stop his glaring. He had to smile. Smile and bite his tongue and play nice with the other kids. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to run into you like dash. He smiled brightly yet cutely awkwardly when he looked up at the person he had lightly pushed up against the wall and had their hands on his shoulders gently. The smile instantly dropped, but his eyes began to shimmer in infatuation. He would recognize that beautiful face anywhere. His hero was here. It's you? Midoriya had his hands against the wall behind his hero. His chin was up against his chest, trying to look up at his face politely initially. The fake smile he had was wiped away by his true expression of awe. He was surprised, but so pleasantly surprised. Enthusiastically surprised. This beautiful boy was looking down at him. His hands were on his shoulders to keep him from falling or from having a more forceful shove. He looked nearly the same as he did that fateful day. Midoriya's expression of awe slowly changed as he noticed something a little different about him. How much colder his eyes had become. His soft face had become sterner. And though he could not see wounds on his arms like he had their first meeting, he could see bandages peeking out from under the collar of his shirt. Whatever was going on at home never got better. It's you, Midoriya said quietly, unable to break their eye contact. Which eye should he focus on more? They were both so beautiful in their mismatched colorization. Beautiful. How beautiful he was reminded that this boy was. He hoped his beating heart couldn't be felt through their physical contact at that very moment. The one from the roof, his name. He wanted to know his name so badly. All these months, swooning and gushing, but he never even knew his name. Never mind their current position, the name of his hero was the only thing on his mind. What's your dash? He tried to ask before it was too late. But it was too late. A girl with black hair in a big, poofy ponytail had been walking past them when she noticed the two. She stopped and held her hand delicately under her chin. At least she didn't look mean. Oh, you're in my class, aren't you? We were both recommended. You better hurry up before you're late on the first day, she said with a wonderfully pleasant smile. No, don't take this moment away. Don't pull him away yet. This stupid girl. Midoriya looked back and gritted his teeth but had to pull back away because it would look too embarrassing to continue this position. Iyeki was all the beautiful hero student said, taking a few steps towards the girl but turning his head to look back at the little villain. We can talk later. Later. They'll see each other later. How much later? Did it matter? There was going to be a later. Later then, Midoriya stuttered, holding his hand up in an awkward wave goodbye. But he didn't want to say goodbye again. How much longer would he be forced to wait? Midoriya had his hands clasped together at his chest as he tried to navigate the halls to his class. Feeling his heart pound so fast under his skin in this manner was so new. He wasn't killing like he was the night before or studying the insides of a corpse. This came from someone alive and beautiful. He was so close to him just now. They had been right up against each other just like that time he helped him down from the roof. He never noticed how strong he physically felt. Finding his way to class just before the bell, he sat down in a seat closest to the window and tried to ignore most of his classmates. They looked just as plain as he did. He would bet that most of their quirks weren't anything to brag about. He found their giddy faces obnoxious and their enthusiastic voices annoying. Was this how Shigaraki felt around people? For now, he would just want to keep to himself. Soon Midoriya would hear the voices of some of his classmates become more hushed. It was a sudden shift in noise and it sparked the little villain's curiosity. Glancing away from the window, from the corner of his eye, he watched a student with tired eyes and purple hair walk in and sit down in silence. A small gaggle of students was looking at him and whispering to each other just close enough for Midoriya to hear. "That's Shinso, don't talk to him." "What? Why not? He's pretty scary looking first off." "Yeah, but his quirk is super sketchy. If you talk to him, he can control your mind." "Creepy? Super creepy." Midoriya peeked at the student that was the subject of this gossip and at least acknowledged him. A quirk that could let him control minds. How useful a quirk like that would be of use to Shigaraki. But this was a hero school. Convincing the students to switch sides is a challenge and he had to focus all his efforts right now on that beautiful boy. However, someone like this kid, Shinso, should be kept in mind. At least their homeroom teacher was a familiar face with a familiar voice. Though their teacher had a very obnoxiously loud and ecstatic voice. Midoriya remembered how he'd listened to that voice in his favorite podcast when he still liked heroes. He was so much louder and brighter in person. "Good morning." The pro-hero present mic practically screamed, signaling all the talkative students to sit down and go silent. Midoriya covered his ears and grumbled quietly to himself. So noisy. This semester was going to be a nightmare at this rate. He wanted to go home and play video games with Shigaraki and experiment on another test subject, not be surrounded by annoying kids his age and a loud teacher. He didn't want to play little schoolboy anymore, but this was for Shigaraki. This was for that beautiful boy. This was to kill all the heroes that raise expectations and then destroy dreams so carelessly. He would have to suffer for now if he ever wanted to get anywhere. "Congrats on getting into UA, guys." "Yeah." Present Mike greeted and held a hand to his ear, expecting a response but got silence instead. But that was not about to ruin his mood or his personality. He was probably used to it. "So I'm your homeroom teacher, Yamada Hizashi. I'll also be your English teacher and quirk trainer." He made finger guns and proceeded to position himself in odd poses after every other sentence. Midoriya envied his energy. "You guys may be in general studies, but that just means you can get a taste of every possible course. So we'll spend most of the day observing different classes based on your interest." "Observing?" Midoriya looked towards present Mike with a side glance, but he had his curious attention now. The other students looked around at each other, also curious about what this observing would entail. This school was not like others due to the variety of hero-related classes in addition to the typical high school education. The morning will consist of your typical high school things like math, social studies, English, literature, etc. Once all of those are covered, you will observe a different course of your choosing and take notes. Then the late afternoon will have you try to enhance your abilities and see if the course you observe is what truly aspire to do. Midoriya made a face as he sunk his chin into his palm. That last part is where he would be left out, wasn't it? He didn't have a quirk to train. He would be placed with the school nurse for private lessons instead, but Midoriya watched as the student named Shinso slowly raised his hand. "Will we be able to observe the hero classes?" he asked with a monotone voice. All of the students became tense at the sound of his voice. Would their homeroom teacher respond and be mind-controlled? Would a scary-looking person like that pull that stunt on the first day? Like some villain? Of course. Class 1A and 1B are the kids your age, but I would also recommend watching the older students as well. Class 1A was fine. Midoriya's eyes slowly widened and shimmered with hope. He would see that beautiful boy. No one would question him. He would watch students get hurt and try to think on the spot what would heal them quickest. He could watch the class being taught by All Might, study their quirks, and let Shigaraki know how to get closer to the symbol of peace. Suddenly this was all so perfect. And thus that was how the day commenced. Shinso never brainwashed anyone that morning, although many students kept their distance from him. Typical classes were run through and completed with note-taking and focus. Midoriya knew he had far more anatomy than any student in this school. But he still had to study and understand basic academics if he wanted to proceed to be in the school successfully and blend in with the other kids. However, he did not pass up the opportunity to take out his personal notebook and take notes on the teachers themselves. Midnight, Present Mike, Ectoplasm, Snipe, Hound Dog, 13, Cementos, Power Loader, the staff were all pro heroes with impressive knowledge and power. Midoriya would have to let Shigaraki know that All Might is well protected with incredible allies. But then came time for the mandated observing. The class was taken to a dark room with dozens of computer monitors hanging up on the walls. All of them were currently turned off until Present Mike went to the main control panel. Because it's the first day, I won't make you take notes just yet. Look around. Pick a screen, pick a topic, pick a subject. Explore all of the possibilities. One by one, all the screens turned on and many showed live camera footage from different classes. There were smaller screens below the big ones that showed quirks and names of all the students that were in the class being shown. Midoriya was immediately drawn to monitor of Class 1A where they were outside near the athletic fields doing quirk testing. Many of them looked stressed, like someone just threatened to expel them if they failed. He watched intensely as they were showing off basic athletic skills like throwing, running, leaping, balance, grip strength, and other fitness exercises. Midoriya watched them, his hands clasped tightly at his chest. He was nearly shaking with anxiety as one finger began scratching at the top of his wrist. Where was he? Where was he? He was in that class, wasn't he? He had to be. He was the only hero that deserved to be in it. Well, you look tense, Present Mike said cheekily from behind the little villain. The closeness of his voice made Midoriya flinch and turn towards him, a bit frazzled. He blushed and lowered his head awkwardly. There was no excuse for his behavior. Midoriya is Zuko, right? Present Mike lowered the volume of his voice for once that day and had a less extreme smile on his face. This man was suddenly much softer. He remembered his name, so quickly too. I was surprised to see someone without a quirk in this school. They sure made it tough on you guys to get in. I'm impressed, the teacher praised with a grin. He had a nice grin. Midoriya liked it. And you got into the medical course too. That got me. You were one of the only ones that passed, so I didn't worry so much about you when I heard that. He rubbed the back of his head. I would hate for you to feel left out of this school when we have kids with these insane powers. I hope you can find your place here. Midoriya felt his chest beat a bit harder than normal. This teacher was so obnoxious, loud, and childish, but also very sweet and considerate. He was left speechless for a few moments because it had been so long since a pro hero had been so kind. So real. So comforting. So bright. Would it be wrong to tell Shigaraki not to kill this one in particular? So what's up? Present Mike asked, looking at the screen the villain had been so fixated on up until now. He was smart enough to notice the general source of his students' anxiety. But I'm looking for someone, Midoriya admitted. And it was when he looked back, he saw that beautiful boy once again. He was using his ice to slide across a track of dirt instead of running a race with 3 other classmates. One was that black spiky-haired kid that grabbed him by the hair earlier. When that student lost that race, he breathed out a blast of fire to melt the ice left behind out of anger. A fire-breathing quirk. The sight of it made a nasty glare appear on Midoriya's face. But that wasn't the boy he was focused on. The one with the white and red hair, he pointed at his hero. Present Mike took a look at the student on the screen, held his hand to his chin, and leaned in close to the smaller, lower screen to look for a name. Todoroki Shudo. Half cold, half hot. You know him? Todoroki Shudo. Midoriya felt his face blush once more as he subtly hugged himself. At last, his name. His eyes became hazy and a blissful grin spread across his face. Even if he couldn't talk to him like this, he could watch that beautiful boy, Todoroki Shudo, every day. Todoroki, he hummed quietly. The perfect name for his hero. He was perfect. Midoriya quickly snapped out of his moment-long trance and shut his eyes tight to help bring him back to reality. I know him. I just haven't seen him in a while, he said timidly to his teacher. Present Mike paid no attention to the villain's little episode and just shrugged with a smile. You'll talk to him soon, I'm sure. Midoriya was far too busy watching the screen and just adoring every second Todoroki was in view. Yeah. Midoriya did not realize until it was too late that the lunch period would involve all the classes at the same time, so it was a mad rush of impatience to get to the cafeteria first. The little villain was squished between students of all sizes and all different quirks. He didn't want to be part of the crowd like this, but he was consumed when he was peacefully on his way. With everyone bumping and pushing up against each other, he just wanted to scream and pull a knife on the other students just to get some breathing room. How bothersome. How humiliating to feel this small. And it was soon enough that he was pushed back and left behind the whole crowd of sheepish students. He fell on his backside and left a disorganized mess on the floor. His blazer was half off one shoulder, his hair was messier than usual, his tie had become slightly loosened, and he was disoriented. He wanted to go home again. All these stupid, lazy, greedy dashed, he started muttering when he heard footsteps from in front of him. Looking up, his heart fluttered once again. His hero was holding out a hand to him. Another shit day, huh? Todoroki asked. How was it that this was the boy was the one that kept appearing before him when he needed someone? Was this the time? Could he finally speak with him again? Could he learn more about him? Could he spend more time with him? Could he be held by him again? To be held by him again. The owner of those strong arms that were once around his waist was here now. The voice of those kind words that gave him a new dream was no longer just in his dreams. In complete silence, Midoriya took his hand to pull himself up with Todoroki's help. But he couldn't contain himself. Just this once, could he not bite his tongue? Could he be true around this boy? He used the inertia of the pole to hug on tightly to Todoroki and press his cheek into his chest. How much he wanted to cry. All this villain work was to save his beloved hero. He gave him his dreams and a purpose. His eyes began to well up with tears, but he couldn't bring himself to cry now. It's you again, he only whispered. Todoroki was once again shocked by the sudden hug and held his arms up slightly to avoid being restrained. He wasn't quite sure how to react to this action again. All he could think to do was place his hands on Midoriya's shoulders gently and hold him there as long as he wanted. He looked down softly, yet with that constant cold demeanor, and just observed the freckled teenager holding on to him for dear life, feel fingers clinging into his back desperately. Has this green-haired boy recovered at all since that summer? Was he able to save him even a little bit? Todoroki Shudo. That's your name, right? I am Midoriya Izuku. How did he know that? My class is all about observing other courses' work. You looked for you. Midoriya soon pulled back and rubbed his face with the balls of his palms to hide any tears that may have escaped his eyes. Sorry, he apologized, realizing how uncalled for the hug was. But then he remembered what he had seen earlier that morning. Oh, Nick, he remembered the bandages he saw. He reached up to try and move the collar of Todoroki's shirt to get a better look. But Todoroki took a step back and covered the left half of his neck out of pure reaction. I'm sorry, he said quietly. He hoped that he didn't offend him because it was merely his instincts at this point. After school, could you let me look? Midoriya pressed just a little bit. It was your father again. I remember. His freckled face subtly sparkled. If you ever want a place to stay, you come with me sometime. His mother would be happy to have him. Kurogiri could warp him wherever he desired. I could dash. The sparkle began to change as a small glow appeared in his irises and his mischievous smile tugged at his lips. He reached up much slower this time with both hands to cup Todoroki's cheeks gently. Take you away, you know? Take him away from everything that was hurting him. Unaware that he was staring in the eyes of a killer, Todoroki was once more fascinated by that freckled face. How he was entranced by it. Midoriya's sweet words were nearly cooed as he held him so gently. His entire presence was shrouded in a dark and poisonous aura, but it was alluring and bewitching. The offerings of kindness were a great temptation. Todoroki was finding it difficult to pass them up and let them slip away. This killer's cheeky smile and illuminating eyes were simply sinister but so sincere. Todoroki nearly answered when they both were shaken by an obnoxiously loud voice just around the corner. Deku, what the hell are you doing here, huh? Bakugo screamed as he oddly stomped closer to the two. Midoriya dropped his hold on Todoroki's cheeks and broke the eye contact they had. He looked to his old childhood friend with a tired glare and didn't flinch when he was picked up by the collar of his shirt. There was no fear to be seen on his face, no tears, nor quivering. How does a quirkless wannabe get into a place for pros? You're just a damn extra. Those words meant nothing. They were just nothing compared to all the support and faith Shigaraki had given him. And thus, the reaction Bakugo would receive was just that, nothing. His comedic, over-the-top rage began to morph as he raised a brow and had his grip tightened on the villain's shirt. Why the hell aren't you saying anything, huh? He growled. The silence was bothering him. It was teasing him. Why wasn't there a reaction? This little nobody would always cry and shake like a baby when confronted like this. But now he was just looking down at him with a sharp, cold stare. It was making Bakugo's hand shake with rage as he pulled one hand back and made it spark. You looking down on me now? Is that it? Don't get so cocky because they let you in. There was one more spark, but a cold hand grabbed his wrist before there could be a bigger one. Huh. Todoroki held Bakugo back from trying to hurt Midoriya, and it earned him a narrowed glare. What the hell are you doing? You're not part of this. Bakugo sneered, but the scarred boy was not deterred at all. He's dealt with a worse temper. We were about to go to the cafeteria together. You're holding us up, he said calmly, gaining the freckled boy's attention and causing the most subtle blush. Going to lunch together? It was such a childish thing, but the thought of it made him feel warm inside. He's never eaten lunch with someone genuinely before. How do you losers even know each other? Bakugo narrowed his eyes at Todoroki. They've never met before today, and yet he knew that these two knew each other by how they were interacting just now. Todoroki looked to Midoriya and then to Bakugo, making his own theories and assumptions on the spot. We just met over the summer, he said honestly yet vaguely. Bakugo snarled at his classmate, then glanced back at Midoriya to flinch at a single glimpse of his eyes. There was a subtle red glow, and he would be ashamed to admit that it spooked him. The moment he made eye contact, he swore that he felt the air being cut off in his throat, like a knife slicing through his neck. There was a chill like his blood was running cold. Why was he looking at him like that? Why was he the one feeling afraid all of a sudden? He dropped him. Midoriya landed a bit sloppily. He didn't land cleanly on his feet but didn't collapse to the floor as he used the wall to hold himself up. He stood up straight and fixed the collar of his shirt back in place and adjusted his tie that Kurogiri was nice enough to tie for him. We should get going. Midoriya walked up beside Todoroki with a bright smile that showed nothing more than honest joy, ignoring Bakugo completely. Bakugo would usually never take that kind of behavior sitting down, but the look he just received from that killer was enough to keep him quiet this time. That was not the same Deku from middle school. Todoroki and Midoriya were both keen on the idea of not sitting in the crowded portion of the cafeteria and decided to instead take a quiet corner near a window wall. Midoriya took notice that Todoroki's first choice of food was soba of all things. He liked traditional Japanese things. Was it because he lived a traditional Japanese setting? Or was it a kind of comfort food? Midoriya wanted to know every little detail about him. Obsessed with him. He wanted to give his hero the world. He wanted to know his favorite food, favorite color, his traumas, his darkest fears, his biggest dreams, his deepest desires. He kept his face normal and cheery, but his chest felt ready to explode with the satisfaction of being able to spend this much time with this beautiful boy. That guy really has it out for you. Todoroki started the conversation. He had been so quiet all the times they've interacted. He came off as a good listener, but it was nice to have him engage in conversation now. It made Midoriya happy. I've known him for a long time. We used to be friends. Used to. Were they ever friends? Or did he just cling to Bakugo out of loneliness and stay because he was in awe of his awesome quirk? Bakugo never wanted any part of him as far as he could remember. But now, I can't say that I'd care to ever see him again, he then said quietly, slowly chewing on a piece of meat from his lunch of katsudon. Was he also the reason I found you that day? Todoroki then asked casually but softly, tilting his head down to eat but looking up with intensity in his eyes. And yet that intensity was just focus. He cared. The idea of this beautiful boy caring so much about him made another blush rise on Midoriya's face. But he looked away with an awkward smile. Their first real conversation couldn't be about something else? But perhaps that was on him considering their first meeting. I'd be lying if I said no. He did kinda give me the idea in the first place. He made a fake giggle to try and laugh it off, waving his chopsticks up and down. But I haven't done anything since then, honest. I'm a lot better, he assured. Was he all better though? His eating wasn't doing so well lately, and his wrists were always so red these days. No, he was better. He had new dreams to look forward to and work towards. And it's because of you, you know? Todoroki paused for just a moment as his eyes averted to the side. Did the air around them feel a bit hotter all of a sudden? Midoriya waved his shirt a bit because he felt a physical rise in temperature, but it soon subsided. I just wanted to help. He looked so lost. Todoroki mumbled. He always seemed so quiet when he spoke, always so calm. Midoriya found himself being enchanted by his tone and aura, feeling cool and relaxed now that he was speaking to him normally. He hoped that he could become closer to him. I was lost. But you found me, right? Midoriya smiled sweetly with closed eyes and his chopsticks near his face but pointing away. Even if we're not in the same class, I'm really happy that I get to see you. He was here. And he was there. A villain in a general studies class and a hero in a hero course. A human experimenting doctor was at the testing table and big-hearted boy practicing to save lives. A killer with a loving, warm family and a prisoner was trapped in his own home. Hey, Todoroki, Midoriya began after a few moments of silence. Todoroki appeared to be deep in silent thought when he looked up, giving his attention. If you could have anything in the world, what would it be? He then asked before adding more. I'm not talking about a wish, really. It's something that you would selfishly want. Something that you want in your life. He wanted to take him over. Let the villains cajole their way to his heart by giving him something he deeply desired. Something you want more than anything. Todoroki poked at his noodles and thought carefully about what he wanted to say. He has something in mind the moment that he was asked. It was how he wanted to word it that he wanted to think about. And so he spoke softly and looked out the window to the outside at nothing in particular. I would want my family back, he answered with a bit of delay. Though the answer was vague and made Midoriya tilt his head, it showed that he was listening intently. My mother was sent away a very long time ago. My older sister moved out a while ago but came back recently, which I guess is nice. But my older brothers, he was the youngest. Midoriya took note of every detail in his head. My brother Natsuo is like a stranger. He went to college but I don't think he wants much to do with me. Natsuo never called, never sent a letter, and never stopped by to see him. It sounded like everyone left him at once. But my oldest one, he's supposed to be dead. Midoriya flinched at the mention of the oldest brother's fate. I'm dashed he wanted to apologize but Todoroki continued to speak. I don't think he's dead. There's a shrine in the house. But I'm not allowed to see it. His name is forbidden to say around the house. The villain raised a brow at what he was being told. He wasn't allowed to see his brother's shrine or hear his name. It didn't make sense, especially if endeavor was traditional. But did something else surpass the importance of tradition? I'm being forced to forget him. He's only referred to as a failure. But he's not, he couldn't be. There was no way he was gone. I would just want everyone to come back to me. And with that answer, Midoriya could only smirk. He'd do anything to make this dream so. Oh my. The little old lady, hero named Recovery Girl said, looking at a practice quiz she handed out on the first day of her mini-course training. She was the best healer hero around, so it was no surprise that she was the main teacher for the medical class. Yet she handed out a practice test to get a feel for how much her 3 students knew. Only 3 students passed the entrance exam. It already had the reputation of being a painfully difficult focus, but Midoriya felt more than qualified. And his test scores proved it. He was the first to hand in her practice test, and as she looked over his answers, she was impressed. Midoriya Izuku, dear, are your parents doctors? I wouldn't expect many students to know some of these answers, she said with a smile. If only she knew of all the blood that he could still feel on his hands. But he just made an innocent toothy grin. My family doesn't have a history in the medical field. I'm the first to try, he replied sweetly. The only thing on his mind was the number of bodies that had been burned over the past few months. Midoriya didn't care to make friends with the other 2 students in his training. Instead, he focused much more on his studies and memorizing the chemicals and drugs the school provided the nurse. One word echoed in his head as his eyes scanned every cabinet. Burns. What was under Todoroki's bandages this time? 2nd-degree burns? Or maybe even a 3rd degree? It was on his neck. What nerves were there? Would there be nerve damage? How bad was the pain? Was his quirk able to null it? How long would it take for the wounds to heal? How much would he need? If this kept happening, should he be prepared to use something stronger? While the other students were still taking the practice test, Recovery Girl was peeking at their work to see if they were getting stumped on anything. There wasn't too much pressure on this test since it was just her trying to get a foundation on where to start. But everyone in UA was a tryhard. The veins on the students' foreheads were beginning to swell with stress. Neither one wanted to be the last one finished. So while all attention was on them and their test, Midoriya walked around the office like he was just curious. But he was eyeing one cabinet up on the wall with a few medicinal creams in it that he recognized. The afternoon bell rang and Midoriya left with a false aura of shining purity as the 2 other students seemed lifeless and worn out from their own stress behind him. Recovery Girl waved goodbye to them and began to pack up her things when she took notice of one of the cabinets on the wall. I thought I had more of those, she commented to herself, taking out a sticky note to leave on the door that was a reminder to buy more burn creams. Midoriya stood near the front entrance of the school, swaying forward and back on his feet in anticipation. Staying after school to go somewhere with another student, he has never had the chance to do this before. And now he was able to go somewhere with Todoroki. His chest was beating, but it was with so much excitement. He would heal his wounds and they could talk more. They could talk all night. He could stay out with him as long as he could. There were no more days of dreaming to even see him again. He could spend hours with him now. You didn't have to wait, Todoroki said quietly, coming up beside him. I told you I would see you after school. I didn't mind waiting, Midoriya said, hoping to let Todoroki know that he could never inconvenience him. He wanted to take his hands and take him to Shigaraki and Kurogiri so he could be certain that he was safe. But there was no way a hero in the making would approve of the things they've done. This would take time. Was there somewhere that you wanted to go? Todoroki asked. Midoriya couldn't picture his new friend knowing much about going out either. He seemed like the type to locked inside the house all day, so he wouldn't know any places of interest. Yeah, I have an idea. Midoriya walked beside Todoroki as they went about the city together. Conversation was kept at small talk with Midoriya doing most of the talking, explaining his course and talking about his class and the specifics of his course. He didn't catch himself going on a few tangents and even started muttering to himself about quirks he had seen that afternoon. Though he did not mention the fact that he would love to see the insides of the people with amazing quirks. He couldn't let that part of his life slip out on accident under any circumstance. Through all the rambling and the muttering, Todoroki listened to it all. There were points where he couldn't quite understand what he was saying, but he was learning how to. He liked listening to him talk. He liked watching his face express different emotions of excitement and happiness, annoyance and pettiness. He found himself comforted by his demeanor. They would eventually get on a bullet train where Midoriya would stop talking out of politeness for the setting. But the train was very crowded considering it was the time that students were getting out of school and adults were getting out of work. All the seats were taken and most of the train was crowded. But the two got on anyway and stood close to the wall rather than being squished by people. So many people? Midoriya mumbled quietly. And yet Todoroki didn't seem all that bothered, as he was much more focused on looking out the window. Midoriya got a bit of enjoyment watching his face and the look in his eyes. He was so fascinated by the view and the world passing by so quickly. He never left the house much, did he? The train stopped a few times and more people squeezed their way inside because people need to get where they're going and everyone had somewhere to be. At least no one was rude about it. But as more people got inside, Midoriya found himself becoming a bit anxious. Like all eyes were on him. Like someone was on this train that knew of all the deeds he had committed. Everyone except Todoroki here was a stranger, so the chance of that being true was slim to none. Yet the anxiety was creeping upon him and the pressure of so many people in one place was making him nervous. Everyone around him felt like they were too close. His hands became jittery as his fingers crept up his sleeve and scratched at his wrists to calm himself down. He felt so hot all of a sudden. But the heat from his nails digging into his skin focused it all to his wrists and he could feel himself cool down. The small pain was barely enough to distract him from this random spike of anxiety. Todoroki hadn't noticed the freckled villain's little episode until he saw him bring his arms closer to himself to scratch at them. The scratching was constant, showing him that it was not a simple itch that was causing this reaction. Just as the train stopped one more time, Midoriya would be lightly guided closer to the wall and would have arms on either side of him to keep anyone else from getting much closer to him. Looking forward, all the smaller teenager would see was the shirt, blazer, and tie of that beautiful boy. He was using himself as a shield from people getting any closer and to keep Midoriya from feeling any more squished by strangers. Midoriya, who had stopped scratching now, looked up at Todoroki's face just to see him looking back at the people compressing them a bit more, but he didn't seem angry or annoyed. He simply appeared curious. All these different people in this train and he still seemed intrigued by the world. Outside the window. Constantly looking around. Constantly observing. Constantly thinking. They were so physically close now. Midoriya could feel his heart beating against his cheek. Such a calm rhythm to listen to. He wanted to know all of his thoughts, hear all his feelings. Watching the reflection of the outside world in his bicolored eyes, he could just tell there was a whole other world behind them too. He really was beautiful. When the two were finally freed from the train, Midoriya walked a small way past a familiar middle school and to a park that was just down the street. There was a playground at the entrance, but towards the back of it, there was much more open space with trees and walking cobble paths. On this particularly sunny late afternoon, it seemed so peaceful. Midoriya nudged Todoroki as he took him to the back area and sat down beneath one of the trees in the grass. "I thought you'd appreciate being away from the city for a little bit," he said, putting the bottom of his shoes together and placing his backpack down beside himself. He patted the ground beside him, to which Todoroki also placed down his things and sat down next to him. After sitting together in silence for just a few moments, Midoriya leaned forward to get a little closer to Todoroki. "Will you let me see your injury now?" the little villain asked as he started digging through his bag for a few things he had taken from Recovery Girl's office. "I grabbed these before I left. I wasn't sure what you would need, but something is better than nothing." He was very insistent on helping. Todoroki watched him and merely sighed at his persistence. How could he say no when this villain had gone out of his way to bring all these medicinal things out here for him? So he simply lowered his head and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt and lowered his blazer. Unwrapping the poorly done bandages, a burn wrapped around his neck and slightly down his left shoulder. The shape of the burn was odd as Midoriya leaned closer to examine it. It was more serious on the left side of his neck than the right. And there were small spots on the right side that were without wounds. Was it because of his ice? Likely. But it couldn't just be the ice. Suddenly it clicked and his green eyes widened and a finger touched the front center of Todoroki's neck. "You were choked," he said quietly. The left side took the brunt of the damage because Endeavor was right-handed. He would only need one hand to get around his throat. The ice was able to protect the flames from his fingers, but the left side to the focus of the palm and wrist where the flames were probably stronger. "Todoroki, why don't you tell anyone about this?" the little villain asked worriedly. It was a 2nd degree, but it could have been much more severe had he been anyone else. Midoriya looked terribly upset as he examined the wound further and tried to see the size of a few blisters. He was on his knees and trying to get the best look he could at this point. Todoroki tilted his head to let him get the best view and watched him from the corners of his eyes. "There'd be an uproar," he said quietly with an ice-cold expression. "There's no way anyone would believe anything I said. Heroes don't hurt their kids or their mothers." The number 2 hero couldn't get to where he was by being a shit father. He looked straight ahead when he felt a stinging sensation at the center of the burn when Midoriya started applying a type of liquid. He tried not to flinch, but he gritted his teeth. The media would eat that up, though. They'd be the ones to use that stuff for their headlines, and then there'd be people all over the house and my mother. She doesn't need that stress. And besides, if he did manage to fool everyone and solidify his reputation as a good dad, I'd never get to be a hero. He'd be permanently labeled as a liar or a teenager looking for attention. In this competitive hero world, he'd be kicked out and left behind instantly. What about? Midoriya tried to think of some way to get him out of this situation sooner. He would need solid proof of intentional harm. But it was difficult considering Todoroki and Endeavor likely sparred, although that sparring was probably very one-sided. The only form of proof he could think of. He gently placed a finger on Todoroki's left cheek at the very bottom of the scar. "This was an accident," Todoroki commented. Midoriya took his finger back and continued to lightly dab cream on the burn at his neck. "He pushed my mom to her limit. He just wanted a kid that could surpass All Might because he couldn't do it himself. So he needed someone with the perfect quirk to have this so-called masterpiece. Have you heard of quirk marriages?" Midoriya nodded. He remembered studying the genetics of quirks, and the term was very familiar. "He bribed my mom's family and she was forced into and pressured by everyone around her. I can only remember her crying while everyone was so envious of her." He sounded very angry as the air around him became physically colder. "He put her through so much, and she tried to protect me. She tried so hard. I don't blame her for what she did. She was at her limit and saw my left half to be so unsightly, she poured boiling water on my face. But it was all his fault for pushing her too far." Midoriya covered the wound with bandages gently so Todoroki wouldn't feel as much pain. He had listened to every word and could only think of his own mother. Where would he be without her? She cared about him so much and tried to support him whenever she could. Todoroki didn't have any of that. "Have you talked to her lately?" Midoriya asked. He recalled that she was sent away, but had they spoken? "She's in a hospital in a psychiatric ward. I don't think she would want to see me." "I don't want to see me either," Todoroki answered, buttoning up his shirt again and afterward keeping a palm over his left eye. He didn't like that half of himself either, it seemed. And seeing him like this made the villain beside him sad, but so very angry as well. What he would give to cut Endeavor into pieces on his table. To rip him apart, but leaving him alive to feel all the pain. Watching him feel so humiliated that such a small boy could defeat him and whisk his son away. He wanted more than his blood. He wanted his head. He wanted to steal his son away. He wanted to take away everything that the hero had gained to make him aware of how worthless to the world he was. "I looked forward to seeing you for months," Midoriya said, putting everything back in his bag, holding back all of his inner murderous thoughts. Instead, he smiled softly and shuffled a bit closer to Todoroki. "You could ask my big brother and my dad." Shigaraki would have a heart attack knowing that he was how Midoriya was going to refer to him outside of his villain life. "I told them all about how great you are." He wanted to tell him so badly how beautiful he was to him. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. That would be too embarrassing. "Even today, I was looking all over for you. And I like seeing you now." He kept smiling at Todoroki until he finally uncovered his scar and looked at him, to which he smiled even bigger with a small giggle. And then suddenly the air temperature spiked up again when Todoroki made an expression that could only be compared to a big-eyed cat. Midoriya screamed into Todoroki's old white hoodie at the bar with Shigaraki right beside him, looking over a few papers in a folder, and Kurogiri had just set a bowl of chopped fruits on the counter. Shigaraki paid no mind as he calmly looked through papers and seemed bored by all the printed words. "Rough day?" he asked, blissfully ignoring the muffled screaming. Midoriya unburied his face from the hoodie and ate an apple slice from the bowl. "It was great but terrible. I hate heroes, but He pressed his face back into the fabric and kicked his feet childishly quickly. My teacher and Todoroki are too nice. Oh, so we have a name now. Todoroki Shudo. His quirk is half cold, half hot, in Class 1A with his teachers being Eraserhead and All Might. Is that so? Shigaraki peeked over at his screaming little brother who was overwhelmed with emotions. The little villain was happy to meet Todoroki, but he had a soft spot for his pro-hero teacher, which was a risky thing to have. Shigaraki could work around it. For his little brother, he'd figure something out. So what else do we know about your little Prince Charming? He asked with a sly smirk. It's not like that. Midoriya retorted, but this argument has come up before and he was never the winner. His face was flushed as he fiddled with the sleeves of the hoodie. He's pretty quiet. And he's still getting hurt at home. He won't tell anyone because of how skewed everything would get because of the media, and he thinks if he loses, it'll ruin his chances of being a hero because he'll be branded a liar. He then gritted his teeth and his nails dug into the wood of the counter. Hero Society will rip Todoroki apart. He's tiptoeing around everything in silence so he could be something the world saw as honorable. He was living a terrible life because of the heroes. Endeavor could only get away with this because he was so popular and powerful. I want him to come here. He'll be safe here. Shigaraki listened carefully and put the folder and papers down. He rested his elbow on the counter and put his cheek on his palm. If he's got that heart of gold, how will you get him here? He asked. It wasn't a rude question, but a realistic one. He wants to see his brother who, may or may not be dead. Midoriya answered but squinted one eye and averted his focus from side to side because that wish would be impossible if this big brother was dead. He thinks he's alive. But, he doesn't remember his name. So I doubt he remembers what he looks like. Shigaraki rolled his eyes at what he was being told. Couldn't this kid just want money or something? Where the hell am I supposed to start with that? He muttered quietly to himself. Midoriya went on to explain the details of what his academic life would consist of between basic education, course observations, and medical training. Shigaraki and Kurogiri listened, and they both used that information to understand how they would need to be working from now on. Midoriya wouldn't need to practice much anymore because he'd be doing that at school. But he was losing a ton of work time on subjects because his academics were still a priority because he needed to stay in school. Then there was the problem of how much time he could get away with being at the bar instead of being at home with his mother. She hadn't bothered him much, yet. Surely she would get suspicious or worried as to where her son was going overnight. So, is there anyone in the lab right now? Midoriya asked, eating a few more pieces of fruit. He was eager to get back to his usual villain work. School, in general, had left him in a foul mood and he wanted to take his mind off of most of it with work. There's a sidekick down there. She's alive, so be careful. Kurogiri answered as he took off Midoriya's blazer. And don't wear your school clothes because they'll get soiled. Can't have the little boy going to school covered in bloodstains. And I want your notes by tomorrow night. I need them for something important. Shigaraki added. What kind of something? Midoriya's heart sped up a bit. His work was finally going to produce results. But what were these results? My master's doctor would like them. In return, he's going to make us something very powerful with your research. You don't talk about your master much. And I've never heard of this doctor person. Midoriya was quick to respond because this was an opportunity to learn a bit more about Shigaraki. He's often referred to as All for One, in contrast to All Might's One for All. He has power beyond any other human. Kurogiri answered instead, but he got the little villain's attention. My dear friend is believed to be immortal. But immortality is cruel on a man's body, so he needs a doctor to tend to him in his latest years. That doctor is of use to us, however. The dark fogman's clouded body began to form sharper clouds in anger. That doctor and Kurogiri don't get along that great, Shigaraki said before Kurogiri even began to lose his temper. He's a sketchy bastard. But he can do some crazy things. As soon as I saw you, I knew you and he would be able to create something powerful together. I've been sending him your research and he's pretty impressed by it. Midoriya began to turn red from prideful embarrassment. Shigaraki's master's doctor was impressed with him. His work. His research. His passion. So this was all going towards something big. He suddenly felt so much pride that he toned down his flushed face and smirked confidently. Then I'll get back to it right away, the little doctor smiled. Midoriya stayed the night at the bar and would likely be staying there much more often. If his mother had any questions, she could always call. He returned to the bar with black clothing stained in red and tired look in his eyes. He had gone from the lab to his room and back to the bar with a neat stack of papers that were typed and printed out with sketches intact. He dragged his feet to the stool next to Shigaraki and sat down beside him, placing the papers down in front of him before leaning against him with his full weight. Shigaraki didn't get put off balance by the weight and didn't fight the subtle form of affection. He took the papers and flipped through them one by one in silence. This would go on for at least a few minutes, where the two sat in silence except for the quiet buzzing of a light and the flipping of papers. "You've done good work," Shigaraki would finally say, slowly reaching up to pat Midoriya's head. "And I'll see what I can get on that older brother." Midoriya smiled with his eyes resting at Shigaraki's words. He was going to try everything he could to get Todoroki here, even with such limited resources. But he couldn't help but feel a bit guilty. Was this just going to be a waste of time? A waste of effort? People trust in heroes too much. Shigaraki began, getting the freckled villain's attention. They want them to do everything for them, so they don't do anything themselves. Getting the number 2's son on our side will make them doubt their beloved protectors. His transition would not be quiet. We'd make it flashy. We'd have everyone's eyes on us. They'll see what a threat we are and how weak their society is. But if we had 2 sons of a famous hero, it'll be that much more impactful. No, this wasn't a waste of time. Shigaraki was resourceful and clever. No act or decision would be wasted. He was never wasteful. Did his master teach him to be that way? Midoriya could only wonder, too careful to ask. But at least now he felt reassured that he wasn't being a hindrance. However, more than anything, I just want to save him and give him somewhere safe. Like you did me, Midoriya whispered. Exhausted. Saving Todoroki was his first priority, and giving him anything he wanted to feel safe, just like Shigaraki had done for him. Todoroki, Midoriya mumbled, slowly waking up just before his alarm the next morning. He was in his hideout bed, snuggled up closely with the beloved white hoodie that had been given to him months ago. It was difficult to sleep without it. All the all-might merch he had in the past could not compare to the pricelessness of a piece of fabric in his arms. Sitting up to look at the time on his phone, he still held it. Scrolling through daily notifications and news, he kept it close until the alarm to get ready for school went off. Pull up, then through there, down and then tug. At the bar, Kurogyari stood in front of Midoriya where the little villain mirrored his movements of tying a tie. Shigaraki sat at the counter just smirking to himself, finding their interaction very funny. It was yet another reminder that Kurogyari was molding into a pathetic fatherly role and Midoriya was still an inexperienced child. He just watched them from the corner of his eyes with a question swirling in his mind. "Your parents didn't teach you how to do that?" he asked. He didn't remember learning about the freckled villain's family life. "My mom wouldn't know stuff like that, though she'd probably try if I asked. But my dad," Midoriya began to answer and just shrugged with a half-smile and looking towards the ceiling. "Never knew him." Shigaraki blinked a few times at the casualness of the answer. It suddenly made a lot of sense as to why he had grown so attached to Kurogyari. And that little villain walked past the counter, snatching a piece of toast off a plate that had been set for him and headed to the door. "What about you? You never talk about yours," Midoriya asked back but was still keeping it casual. It was too early for deep trauma stories, but it was never a bad time to try and learn more about each other. "I don't really remember." Midoriya stopped at the door, having it cracked open and ready to leave. He stayed there for a few moments to watch Shigaraki scratch at his neck lightly when he answered. "You call that hand father, right?" "Yeah, I do." "Are your memories more prominent with your master?" "Yeah." The little villain remained there for a couple of seconds longer before shrugging again. "I'll see you later," he said before going off on his way. He had quite a few things to think about on his way to school. Things about Shigaraki were suddenly starting to make a little more sense. Shigaraki had someone in his life similar to what Todoroki was to Midoriya, Someone gave him a purpose and a reason to live. It must have been his master. His master must have trained him and brought him to the world of villains, and now he was guiding him in the background to grow. His master could afford a powerful and sophisticated doctor, and his master likely provided him with the laboratory in the bar basement. His master must have given him Kurogiri to give him more personal guidance due to how much Kurogiri seemed to respect him as a close friend. And if his master was in declining health, Kurogiri was a constant figure that was there for him. But that severed hand. Although Shigaraki never wore it around Midoriya anymore due to how comfortable he had become around him, he's called it father, and he always kept it at arm's reach. He never went anywhere without it. He always wore it around strangers or when he was fighting. Without memories of his family, perhaps that hand is all he had. Midoriya was walking on the sidewalk when he stopped at that thought. He had an odd thought. A curious thought. A sad but very real thought. Does Shigaraki ever feel lonely? So much hatred was welled inside of him, there was no family in his recollection. All he had was a dying master and Kurogiri, and their relationship seemed formal when they first met. He couldn't help but wonder what his big brother could be thinking about. What kind of things would go through his head every day? Midoriya took out his phone and looked at Shigaraki's contact number. Maybe he should text him more often. Look out. A random voice called out amongst the crowd of people walking the morning city sidewalks. And it was suddenly that a giant villain grew to the size of a small house and ran out of a common bank. The entrance to the building was destroyed, and there was a blast of smoke and debris that covered a portion of the street Midoriya was on. The boy held his forearm up to his mouth so he wouldn't breathe in anything dangerous as many people began to run away from the commotion. It wasn't long at all for heroes to arrive on the scene. And just as the heroes arrived, more villains and common criminals began to creep in and take advantage of the chaos, sneaking in to loot nearby stores and picking up dropped belongings that people had dropped in a panic. It's too early for this, Midoriya grumbled, turning to jog away from the nonsense that was taking place. The villains were going to lose, there were too many heroes, and that was obvious. Shigaraki wasn't stupid to do something like this, he had much more tact. Rather than being worried about the situation at hand, Midoriya was trying to think of the quickest detour to school because he would likely be late at this point. How troublesome. Amid his mental mapping and debating, the initial villain was thrown against a wall of buildings right beside him by a hero. The giant hero's ankle just nicked a lamp post and made it wobble then fall. Midoriya looked up and tried to move his feet quick enough to get out of the way of the metal pole. He wasn't fit enough. He was reminded of how weak he was and incompetent he physically was. When the lamppost fell, he was lucky that the top of it hit a car that was able to cushion its fall, so it only knocked the little villain down and kept him trapped underneath. He was stuck on his stomach with the pole weighing down on his back, giving him barely any room to wriggle out from underneath. But he didn't have the upper body strength to pull himself out. This was such a terrible morning. Midoriya looked up at the giant villain that knocked the pole over with a glare as the hero that hit him there in the first place tried to attack him again. The villain moved out of the way of the hero's quirk, which consisted of a massive Venus flytrap arm. That hero made eye contact with Midoriya for just a moment when their attempt to hit the villain failed. Midoriya looked at that hero intensely before their eye contact was broken. The hero turned their attention to the giant villain and chased after him instead. Figured out that heroes don't always come, huh? Shigaraki's words echoed in his head. Heroes prefer flashy villains to fight to get them more screen time. Heroes rather fight for the credit of apprehending a villain than saving a plain-looking schoolboy. Ignored. He was completely ignored. A few citizens ran past him, looking out for their own safety. None of them stopped to help him. They didn't even look at him. They want them to do everything for them, so they don't do anything themselves. You damn dash, Midoriya growled bitterly as he struggled to free himself from under the pole. He gritted his teeth as he pathetically kicked the ground to try and push himself out. And it was then that another villain was thrown against the wall of buildings with a car. The amount of force caused the windows to shatter and broken glass began to rain down. Midoriya could only look up in horror. And quickly lower his head, covering it with his hands. He felt so pathetic. So helpless. All the confidence he had when in the laboratory was gone in the outside world. He was still weak. He was so weak. Behind him, he felt an intense heat out of nowhere. But in front, above, and below, it suddenly became bitterly cold. He heard glass start to hit the ground and shatter on impact, and yet none of the shatterings were remotely close to him. He slowly lifted his head and saw the back of a gray blazer and a certain someone with red and white hair in front of him, with ice surrounding him like a shield while shards of glass were scattered on the ground. Of course. That beautiful boy was always there. He was always there when he needed saving. Todoroki? He must have also taken this route to school. This area was pretty close to the train station now that he thought about it. Todoroki put his right hand on the pole to freeze a large section of it and then give it a solid kick with the bottom of his heel to make it shatter, freeing the freckled villain at last. He reached down to grab both his hands and help him back up to his feet. "I didn't know you came this way," Midoriya said, shaking his head a bit to make his senses a bit clearer. Looking at this beautiful boy once again, he got a good view of his face. There was so much worry. His eyes were a bit bigger and his hand still held on tightly to Midoriya's. "I usually don't," he answered quietly. It was very shortly, merely a few minutes, for all the villains to be apprehended by heroes. The media appeared out of nowhere and people gathered to celebrate and cheer on their beloved heroes. All the villains walked in a line with heroes smiling and waving at the cameras, signing autographs, and taking pictures with their fans. Midoriya watched all of their faces with bitter hatred burning up inside of him. He hated them. He hated all of them so much. Todoroki stood beside him, looking around at the destruction that remained behind them. There was so much damage to the city. It appeared so reckless. "Todoroki, if you don't usually come this way, then how did you dash?" Midoriya let his anger subside because he didn't want to deal with it now. He just wanted to focus on the beautiful boy that saved him yet again. But he was cut off when a booming voice shouted over his. "Shuto!" It was a deeper voice and one that belonged to an older man. The little villain watched Todoroki's eyes narrow darkly as he turned to look at the source. That heat wasn't from Todoroki Shuto just minutes ago. "I told you not to wander off too far. You couldn't even follow those instructions?" Endeavor came up behind the two teenagers and towered over them with just natural height and broadness. Midoriya took a step back, but Todoroki did not waver, not even his flaming face frightened him. The villain had yet to see the number 2 hero in person. He was just a little shorter than All Might, but the aura around him did not resonate with one of a heroic persona. He could only feel rage and intimidation coming from this man. This was him. This was the one that kept hurting his beautiful hero. Those burns on his arm when they had first met, and the burned choke marks on his neck just the day before came from the pro hero standing before him. "Someone could have gotten hurt if I didn't?" Todoroki retorted lowly, but his focus averted elsewhere, rudely avoiding eye contact with his father. "You know you aren't allowed to use your quirk in public. Are you ruining your reputation already?" Endeavor scolded. Todoroki gritted his teeth, biting his tongue and doing everything in his power not to snap back. "As a masterpiece, you shouldn't be messing up your future so recklessly. You know better than that, Shuto." Endeavor kept pressing, glaring at his youngest son. But that word triggered a very angry reaction. "Don't you call me that," Todoroki growled, raising his arms slightly only for Endeavor to grab it harshly. Midoriya flinched and took a step forward. He had to intervene. He was supposed to save him. He couldn't let him get hurt right in front of him. But his beautiful hero nudged him back with his shoulder. He wasn't going to let him get involved here. "Take pride in what you are. Stop with this childish teenage rebellion already." Endeavor tugged him forward, making Todoroki walk with him. "We need to go before you're late." Todoroki looked back at Midoriya with an uninterpretable expression. He wasn't begging for help, but he didn't look fine at all. He was practically being dragged but played it off as if he was keeping pace with his father. Midoriya looked back with his head lowered and a little green glow peeking out from under his hair. "I'll take you away," he mumbled. He couldn't do it now. Not with how weak and pathetic he was. He couldn't fight a pro hero like that. But one day, for sure. "I'll kill him. I'll save you." "Todoroki Shuto."